G'day, May 40 here. So Margaret Brennan at CBS News is the gift who just keeps on giving. She's their main anchor on the weekends, and it seems like every week there's a viral moment, and she just has this visceral repulsion towards conservatives. And now, yesterday, on Face the Nation, she was talking to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and she blamed the Holocaust on freedom of speech. Apparently, Germany had way too much freedom of speech, and that was then weaponized, apparently, to launch the Holocaust. So, does Margaret Brennan still have a job by Friday? I mean, it's a gift to conservatives to keep having her there, but she has such a visceral repulsion that I don't know. Is she going to be able to keep this position? But let me just play the doggone clip.
Well, he was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide.
All right, so she's talking about J.D. Vance and the opposition to J.D. Vance in Europe, just the widespread revulsion, but the kind of ineptitude of it is quite similar to the disorganized left-wing reaction to Donald Trump. I mean, what an extraordinary thing to say by Margaret Brennan. And the Holocaust is regarded as this sacred event in the United States, right? The Holocaust has come to play a huge role in American life since the 1970s, when there was a miniseries, I think, on network TV, I think ABC Network, on the Holocaust. And so from the late 70s on, the Holocaust has played a major role in American life, even though none of the Holocaust took place in America. But it has become sacralized, so that you're never supposed to invoke it, to compare it to anything else. And here's Margaret Brennan.
And he met with the head of a political party that has far-right views and some historic ties to extreme groups. The context of that was changing the tone of it. And you know that the censorship was specifically about the right.
No, I have to disagree with you. Free speech was not used to conduct a genocide. The genocide was conducted by an authoritarian Nazi regime that happened to also be genocidal because they hated Jews and they hated minorities and they hated those that they had a list of people they hated, but primarily the Jews. There was no free speech in Nazi Germany. There was none. There was also no opposition in Nazi Germany. They were a sole and only party that governed that country. So that's not an accurate reflection of history.
Well, he was standing in a country.
Just a bizarre comment there by Margaret Brennan.
How about this one? A lot of people talking about this after the weekend. CBS News anchor Margaret Brennan facing controversy this morning over how she characterized Vice President J.D. Vance's rebuke of European leaders for cracking down on free speech in remarks at the Munich Security Conference.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
But Brennan putting the vice president's comments in Germany this way in an interview with Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Well, he was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide. And he met with the head of a political party that has far-right views.
I have to disagree with you. Free speech was not used to conduct a genocide. The genocide was conducted by an authoritarian Nazi regime.
I want to now bring in News Nation media contributor Steve Krakauer, executive producer of the Megyn Kelly Show over on SiriusXM. Steve, Secretary Rubio pointed out that there was no free speech in Nazi Germany. What did you make of her comments and this exchange as a whole?
Yeah, Margaret, I'm very rarely shocked these days when I'm watching what's going on over on, let's say, crusty old legacy media like CBS is. They're not alone in that, but in that realm, this was incomprehensible. I mean, the best case scenario is she misspoke. I suppose you could say speech was weaponized in a sense of like propaganda. But obviously that changes the point entirely. So instead, if you have to really like lean into what she said, the idea that free speech would be weaponized to conduct the Holocaust, to conduct a genocide, is in my opinion, I think what we're seeing from certain forces within the media, that they believe in censorship. These are essentially anti-speech activists that believe that the more we can cede the ground in our own country in 2025 about the dangers of certain kinds of speech, then that's going to essentially help, I guess, the gatekeepers, the establishment, the elite retain power. Some sort of shot at Trump, some sort of shot at Elon Musk. It's completely bizarre and really outrageous. I honestly, I'm like checking as we're going to air to make sure that CBS has not released at least a clarification, if not an outright apology.
Yeah, I was going to ask, or anything from her, or any rumblings about the show moving forward, any sort of repercussions or on-air apology.
I would say at the bare minimum, they need to issue some sort of clarification of what's going on here. But listen, this is a network that last night on 60 Minutes, their marquee program, was talking about essentially a positive profile of the censorship efforts that are going on right now in Germany, about the way that people are cracking down on speech on social media platforms that they view as dangerous, as hate speech. Hate speech hate speech is just like a term like weaponized. That should be a red flag for all Americans that says these people want to crack down on words you're saying. That is all that's going on there. And so I find it actually really alarming. And I think it's only as we get this conversation a little bit meta, having a conversation about this on a cable news network like News Nation is really important, because that shows that this is not across the board in the quote unquote media. We need to be very clear about what we're saying. And CBS News, I think that this is the latest version of both what Margaret Brennan has said and the network as a whole that is really antagonistic towards Americans. I truly believe that is towards Americans by the way that she's framing this. And I think that there needs to be some sort of explanation, or at least a clarification of what she was trying to say, which was completely ahistorical.
We'll see if that comes. Speaking of censorship, free speech, J.D. Vance made that kind of like the headliner of his opening speech in Munich on Friday, that censorship is the biggest danger in Europe, not Russia or China. These comments have caused a fury with critics at home and abroad. Do you think he hit the nail on the head, or do you think he went too far in characterizing it as the #1 threat?
I think he nailed it. And you think, why is that getting criticism? Let's be very clear about what he said. China and Russia is not the danger, or even some sort of boogeyman of illegal immigration in your countries. No, I'm talking to you, the people in this room. You're the danger to your own country because of the way that you are treating your own people. I think that it's a shot across the bow. It's tough love. Look, within that same breath, he's saying, but we want to work with you. We want to be a partner in rebuilding Europe and in working together on the very important issues that we face. Talking about AI earlier in the week and some of the other ones. So yes, I think that it's.
And with that, Steve, he also said in that same speech, but we will let you air, grievances, difference of opinions in the same town square. Do you find it interesting, though, that they just kicked out the Associated Press, the Hill from the Oval Office, Air Force One, the Correspondence Corridor, the Pentagon? Does that seem contradictory to you?
Yeah, look, I think the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America controversy with the AP is a ridiculous one, silly, and then the Trump administration should reverse that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that they're trying to prove some point there, but by doing so, they are essentially leaning into that kind of.
Okay, we have team coverage of the Margaret Brennan remarks about free speech getting weaponized to create the Holocaust. Team coverage beginning with Bob Altberger, our European correspondent, and Mr. Altberger has some points here in the chat. European reaction to J.D. Vance is pathetic. If European countries want to play power politics, they need power, including a powerful functioning military force. Europe is not even a country. Germany has become my vacation destiny of choice the last 2 years. Just don't post anything spicy. CBS News and the European media have a race to the bottom. And got some other comments here. Big picture, is Trump preparing for pivoting to China? All right, as Mearsheimer points out, if you pivot to someplace, it means that you're pivoting away. The big logical move would be to get Russia on side before dealing with China, which seems to be what's happening. Is anyone writing that story? Well, John Mearsheimer is certainly talking about it. Now, I think that Vladimir Putin must be just trembling as he watches the chair of the Munich Security Conference breaking down in tears over J.D. Vance's speech on Friday criticizing European leaders. Europe is currently being governed by extremely unstable and unserious people, says this poster on X.
After the speech of Vice President Vance on Friday, we have to fear that our common value base is not that common anymore. I'm very grateful to all those European politicians that spoke out and reaffirmed the values and principles that they are defending. No one did this better than President Zelensky. Let me conclude, and this becomes difficult.
That's so sweet. He finds a woman to give him a hug and comfort him with his tears. Putin must just be so scared at seeing this formidable array of strong men lined up against him. Whoa. So it appears that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin over the phone have essentially settled the Ukraine war. Our European correspondent Bob Oberger reports articles in the Norwegian media have said Putin is Hitler, that Europe is falling apart, NATO is falling apart. Some John Mearsheimer takes the last couple of days, so the news media and the politicians are spinning in circles. Now, what I think, Bob, what's most important for people in Europe and for people in America and for people in Asia is to land your planes, right? Let go of the resentment. Right, so you got to burn against J.D. Vance, or you got to burn about what Hitler did, or you got to burn about what Germany did. You got to burn about Donald Trump. You got to land your planes that are just buzzing around in your head. Right, be a good, responsible air traffic controller. Let go of your resentment, because then you get to land those planes that are buzzing around in your head, and you just clear up so much space. Right, you know how crappy your computer works when it's just got too many windows open, where all its RAM is getting used for this or that. You're running out of storage, right? You delete a bunch of stuff and you run some sort of program to get rid of the junk and to just free up your computer, restart it, and it may work great. So too, we need to do the same thing for our brains. And one of my favorite things to do, and I'm going to do it right now, I'm going to let go of everything that I think I know. When I let go of everything that I think I know, I also let go of all my resentments, and I let go of all my fears, because my resentments and fears are based on things that I think I know, which are frequently not real. So Europeans need to let go of everything that they think they know, right? We all operate much more effectively and efficiently, not to mention we move more effectively, we move more efficiently, we speak more efficiently and effectively, we breathe more easily when we let go of everything that we think we know. I'm going to do it again. So I just went up a little bit, right? I just let go of everything that I thought I knew. And when you do that, you move into the present moment. You move into a state of awareness, and you can't help but let go of your fears and your resentment, right? You got to land those planes of buzzing resentment that just fly around in your head. And then you get to be much more effective in life. So let's get Michael onto the show. Michael, you're muted, but now you're unmuted. Hey, how's it going, bro?
Good. How are you, 40?
Hey, pretty good, mate. I'm so excited, Michael, because every time I talk to a new person, I get to discover new things about myself. So I'm sure you're an awesome guy, but what I'm primarily excited about here is that in this conversation, I'm gonna learn new things about myself. Isn't that exciting?
Yes.
Do you find that? Do you find that you're a significantly different person in different situations, in interactions with completely different people?
You know, Ford, I've heard you explain this, and I get what you're saying. However, I try to be the same person. I try to have the same persona, like in all the different areas. let me see. So I try to have one persona for all the different like contexts of my life. You know what I'm saying?
Wow. So I know that's your conception, and I know that's your desire, and I'm highly skeptical that happens. For example, do you tend more towards introversion or extroversion?
I think I'm like 50-50. Like I'm pretty introverted, but I can get out there when I need to. So
Okay, so when I'm the same way. I am evenly balanced between extroversion and introversion. But when I've had a setback or a series of setbacks, I become highly introverted. Right? There are very few people that I want to talk to after I've been shamed, humiliated, suffering defeats. And I would assume it's the same for you. After you suffered a series of humiliations, I would bet you're a lot more introverted.
yeah. I mean, sometimes it's funny to just lash out when that happens too, but you know, you have to be self-deprecating. You have to take your humility and good humor, I guess. But you know, I like to hear you talk about this. It's really amazing to me. You're so vulnerable on your streams. I find that incredible, but it's very compelling to listen to.
Oh, thanks, man. And just for giggles, how self-aware would you describe yourself? Because I am constantly struck that there's absolutely no relation between what people say about themselves and what is actually true. That plenty of people who are hilarious don't think they're funny. Plenty of people who think they're funny are not funny at all. A lot of people who think they're really smart are really dumb. And a lot of people who think they're dumb are actually quite smart. So just for giggles, how would you assess your level of self-awareness?
Well, I think I would say I'm usually pretty confident in myself, but like you said, you know, we all have moments where we have setbacks. But on that theme, what you're saying, I think that applies to writing too. I've been thinking about this, that you have people who literally their career is writing, but they're bad at writing, and there's no way to explain it to them. I mean, you can explain a grammar rule, but you can't just tell someone you don't have it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, you're a writer. You know that.
Yeah. So this is when I learned that I was a good writer. It was second grade, and we were sitting on a little bridge over a creek, and we were looking at these logs submerged in the water, and we were supposed to write about them. I didn't really know how to do the assignment, so I just started writing things, and then we had to share with the class. And I was just amazed at the intensity of the reaction to what I wrote, and I suddenly realized by social cues that I was pretty damn good at this. When did you realize that you were good at writing?
Well, you know, I think first it's what kind of writing we're talking about. So I don't know if you've written fiction, and I don't think I could quite pull off, you know, writing a novel. And so what I've settled on is that I think I can write decent, just kind of expository type of writing. But those that can create a story, that's a whole different ballpark. So
to introduce you, could you name some of your favorite movies? I didn't prepare you for this, but just off the top of your head, any favorite movies that come to mind?
Okay. Like the. Okay, first of all, I think when you think about what are your favorite movies or what are your favorite books, I think the only way to figure that out is to think about a book or a movie that you've watched multiple times, and you just have to assume that that's one of your favorites, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So if that's the criteria, I would say The Aviator. Really loved that movie. I haven't really watched it recently, but for a time I was just very into that. I used to like to watch some of the Shakespeare films, Mel Gibson, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. But I don't know. I'm not that much of a
shows, TV shows or books. What are some of your favorite books?
Okay, sorry. I think Godfather is my favorite movie. It took me a second, but I rewatched that and I was very touched by it. So,
how many times have you seen it? Just curious.
Like Not that many times. I haven't. Probably like 5. Because it's been around since my childhood. So you watch something as a child, and it's like you're not even really watching it. So, but I get some of my Netflix recommendations from you, and I steal some of your ideas. You were talking about Primeval, and then I watched that, and then you talked about Jerry Springer. I watched that too, and then we both watched OJ. I don't know if I heard you talk about that.
Yes, yeah. So let's start with American Primeval. I couldn't think of a TV series that better encapsulated my worldview. I can't think of a TV series that better illustrated the state of nature as I believe it is. So the state of nature is a mythical state without civilization, and American Primeval conforms to a Hobbesian view of the state of nature, where life tends to be nasty, brutish, and short, as opposed to the John Locke view of the state of nature, where there are just ample opportunities for cooperation and peaceful trading in a state of nature. I just thought we're all locked in an iron cage together. I think that's the best metaphor for understanding international relations. So you're strongly incentivized to be as strong as possible. And not to mention, I just couldn't stop watching it. I was enthralled. I watched it twice. I thought it was incredibly profound, that it wasn't so much I didn't experience it as a series primarily about good guys and bad guys. It's just different groups fighting to survive in a brutal world. What was your reaction to American Primeval?
Okay. So it's been a minute since I watched it, but I thought there was a bad guy, and the bad guys were the Mormons. I'm not saying Mormons are really bad people, but according to that,
in the series. Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Because now that massacre really occurred historically. Like I wouldn't be surprised if you looked into that too. However, the one historical detail they changed was that in American Primeval, there are a couple of Mormons, a few Mormons in with the group that the Mormons themselves slaughtered.
Yes.
And then after the fact, they were perfectly willing to kill them too, just to continue the cover-up. However, historically, there were no Mormons in that group. Rather, the group was a group of French immigrants who were believed to have attacked the Mormons. So it was a little bit more straightforward. And there was no element of Mormons killing Mormons. So I believe the American Primeval made the Mormons look more diabolical than they were, perhaps.
I didn't see it that way at all. I saw the Mormons trying to survive in a brutal world where their own leader had been murdered, where many of their own people had been murdered. They were trying to establish the equivalent of Zion for Jews. They were trying to create their own state. And as part of that, just like Jews needed to use terrorism and ethnic cleansing and brutal tactics to establish the Jewish state, so too the Mormons had to do the same tactics that are required to carve out your own niche in the world. That I don't believe land belongs to anyone. Land only belongs to those who can seize it and then defend it. And the Mormons were simply doing what any other group would do to try to seize, control, and defend a particular territory so that their own people and their own culture could survive. So I didn't feel like the Mormons were bad guys at all. I respected in the series, and I respected and recognized that the Mormon leader Brigham Young would both use beautiful, soaring religious rhetoric, and there's a very valuable time and place for that and an audience for that. At the same time, he had to be able to nod to an assistant to carry out brutal measures to establish a place where you can try to live out this religious vision. Right? You can't live out his religious vision without safety. Right? Nothing good can happen in life until you have safety. Right? If you're on a date, nothing good is going to happen on your date until both of you feel safe. Until that time, nothing good is going to happen. And so the Mormons, like any other group trying to seize territory, control territory, and defend territory so that their people could feel safety, has to do brutal things in this sort of context. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting, and I agree with you. but I think it's like a very intellectual conception of the events of the series, whereas I think if you just take it at face value, I would say that the intent was not a very sympathetic treatment of the Mormons in American Primeval.
And what about, do you see other good guys and bad guys in the series? I
Yes.
guess go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So I heard you discuss this series, and I had watched, I believe, the first episode, and my first reaction was, wow, I love the treatment of American history and the American frontier, because it's showing that these were really people who built everything themselves. They didn't, steal it. They weren't given it. However, I think in general, the series does kind of perpetrate the noble savage myth in terms of Native Americans, because they were really never the perpetrators in any wrongdoing at any point, whereas pretty much every other group did have that agency. Not that I want them to be portrayed negatively, but it was just, it kind of fell in line with modern film's treatment of Native Americans, in my opinion.
Okay, so you did have American Indians taking part in the massacre, right, of the
Yes.
the main massacre. So there were American Indians, and you certainly had American Indians, aside from that, who were also quite eager to slaughter our groups.
Yes.
And what I loved about the series is that you had different approaches by a group that was headed for defeat. So one approach was you kill your enemies even if you get killed. And then the other approach is we are headed for defeat. The only path forward for our people is to compromise and to assimilate to the dominant power. So I loved that description because that is also very true to life.
Yeah, and I happen to be reading a book about the War of 1812, and it talks a lot about these alliances between the British and Native Americans against the Americans. So yeah, that definitely rang true to me. Although I'll say in this book about War of 1812, the British would always kind of threaten the Americans like, we can't promise what's going to happen. If we unleash our Indian allies, then you're going to have to be responsible for that. So they were kind of used as like the shock troops in that context. Yeah.
So often politicians who come across as nice guys, they have to have lieutenants who are willing to do the brutal things. And
right.
And so we tend, I don't like the good guy, bad guy dichotomy for people. I just don't find it useful. I'm much more of a situationist. So often we think of this person's a nice guy or that person's a bad guy, but we're all nice in certain situations, bad in other situations. Do you hold to the more traditional view that there's such a thing as moral character, or are you a situationist like me and our character will be very different in different situations?
I agree with you, but I think that a lot of times people's their moral character is a lot of times tracks with their intellectual capacity in a way that I think your ability to reason, it seems to me like connected with your awareness of right and wrong and your consideration of what is right and wrong. But I don't like to view people as good guys and bad guys, because it's just not a helpful way to approach life. And if you regard people as a bad guy, it's like, where do you go from there? I mean, I think you just have to kind of accept people as they present themselves.
And I thought that the characters in this series were quite nuanced. That they had many different sides to themselves. That they had brutal sides, but they also had kind and compassionate sides. Another thing that I loved about the show is that it demonstrated the importance of in-group loyalty. And so in the first episode of the hit TV series Yellowstone, this Indian guy says to a white guy, until they find a cure for human nature, man belongs with his own kind. right?
Right.
The people belong with their own tribe. People usually do better with their own tribe. Do you subscribe to this tribal understanding of human nature?
I don't know. It might, for some people, that might be what they want to do. It's not necessarily, my approach to life. I tend to mix well with people of other tribes, so-called. But getting back to good guy, bad guy, I do know one bad guy, and that's O.J. Simpson.
Okay, wait, I'll get to that soon. But as far my primary criteria for a movie or a TV show is, do I feel compelled? Like, does it hold my attention? Yeah. And so American Primeval held my attention. It was great, 10 out of 10 on that basis. How was it for you?
Okay. Well, I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10. My only criticism was that I did think it was gratuitous violence. Not like I was offended by it, but I just tend to kind of tune out when there's too much action. Like, how many times are they gonna, save that woman? And it just, it was actually quite gruesome, the show.
Yeah,
maybe you're desensitized to that, but
yeah, I'm so desensitized. I don't know. I just no. There are certain types. Like I'm sure there are network TV shows that I would not watch because they don't have a good effect on me. So there are different approaches to sex and to violence that just do not work for me. And then there are other approaches like Game of Thrones. Like I thought that was an enthralling show. Did you watch Game of Thrones?
No, sorry, I didn't.
Oh, okay, no problem. And what is your view of the state of nature? Are you more of a Hobbesian, where you expect that the state of nature is a place where life is short, is brutish, nasty, brutish, and short? Or are you more of a Lockean, that the state of nature is a wonderful opportunity for trade and making deals with other people?
I'm not really that philosophical. I don't necessarily see life in either of those frames. I don't think but I guess I don't see a particular. I guess you could say I'm like an existentialist. You know what I mean? I think that whatever meaning you get out of life is just what you impose upon it. So it's hard for me to characterize society as being Hobbesian or Lockean. It's just.
Okay, so I'm definitely much more of a Hobbesian, and so therefore I recognize the need for more of a strong central state. For example, we didn't prepare this, but Edward Snowden. I've gone back and forth on this, but after reading a book on Soviet spying in the United States during World War II, like I'm leaning much more towards Edward Snowden's a traitor. We need this kind of government surveillance. Do you have a reaction to Edward Snowden and his revelations about our government surveillance?
Okay, so when you put it that way, I actually agree with you that, if that makes me a Hobbesian, that I do have somewhat of a relatively like pessimistic view of human nature, that you do need consequences, and that, I guess that's why I'm kind of falling on the conservative side, because I think you do need to punish people when they do bad things, and they will do bad things unless there's going to be a consequence. And then to the Snowden, I heard you discussing that earlier, and I would just say that, it's fine if they're using that security infrastructure to screen for terrorists, but we've already seen that that's turned in on us. So that's just my first thought about that.
And do you believe that, another theme from American Primeval, do you believe that land belongs to different people, that this is Comanche land, or this is Jewish land, or this is, I don't know, Norwegian land, or are you much more on the pragmatic side that no people have a transcendent right to any particular plot of land? It just depends on what you can seize and what you can defend.
Yeah, certainly at that time, it's the latter, that it's what you can seize and defend. And I think that, you can really lament the fact that Native Americans lost their land and their way of life. However, we're all a product of American society, so you can't go too far with that because it's like you're disavowing all the amenities of modern life that you enjoy. Now, nowadays when you try to take over land, it becomes a little bit more controversial. So,
okay. And we both watched O.J. Simpson. I was living the O.J. Simpson 4-part Netflix documentary. I read several books on it. I love the 10-part miniseries on the O.J. Simpson trial, and it was an experience in the United States of America that many people will never forget, how Black America celebrated the not guilty verdict for O.J. Simpson in the criminal trial, while the rest of America was just appalled. So it was an eye-opening experience for millions of Americans. They had no idea that the experience of life was so different for Black Americans as opposed to non-Black Americans. 4-part series now dropped on Netflix a few weeks ago. It shows how overwhelming the evidence was against O.J. Simpson, many of the shortcomings of the prosecution. And what was your reaction to this Netflix series on O.J.?
Oh, there are just so many angles. First of all, I think that the series was presented with the assumption that he was guilty, I think. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
But they allowed some of the team, like Johnny Cochran's team, to kind of just give their side of it. And whether they believe that OJ was guilty is another thing. But I guess even if you're a lawyer for someone, I'm sorry, Luke.
Yeah, you can go if you got to go.
Okay.
Yep.
All right,
yep.
Luke. I'll be in touch. Sorry about that.
Yep. No problem. Yep. Okay. Life comes first, guys. Life comes first. Don't say things on a live stream that are against your self-interests. And if you got something else that comes up in life that's more important than sharing your opinions on a TV show, then by all means, all right, go put life first. All right, topping the news. Let's go to Fox here.
And won't accept any deals made without its input.
We're going to get expert analysis on what it will take to end the war with former White House National Security Council Chief of Staff Alex Gray.
But first, let's get right to Jackie Heinrich. She is reporting live from West Palm Beach for us at this hour. What is the latest from there? Hi, Jackie.
Hey, Sandra. Yeah, the president's team, which includes Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, is set to sit down with the Russians tomorrow in Saudi Arabia. But ahead of that meeting, the Russian Foreign Ministry set a pretty hard line, which was no territorial concessions as part of any peace deal. It follows Ukrainian President Zelensky's warning to President Trump that Putin does not actually want peace.
What I can tell you is I know of no better negotiator in American politics than President Trump.
Yeah.
I think President Trump will know very quickly whether this is a real thing or whether this is an effort to buy time. But I don't want to prejudge that. I don't want to foreclose the opportunity to end a conflict that's already cost the lives of hundreds of thousands.
President Trump disagreed with Zelensky that Russia wants just a pause in fighting to reestablish its war footing. He also disagreed that Russia would wage war on NATO if U.S. support shrinks. But Germany's reportedly getting concerned, this morning ruling out sending peacekeeping troops to Ukraine without full U.S. involvement. Europe has been clamoring for a seat at the negotiating table after Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth spooked some allies by nixing the prospect of future NATO membership for Ukraine and broadcasting that the U.S. would not send peacekeeping troops in what many lawmakers and diplomats viewed as an unforced show of hand, speaking out of turn. VP Vance worked to soften those claims in Munich. He said nothing is off the table, but Ukraine is still unsettled that President...
All right, Michael Beckley is a favorite intellectual and academic of mine. He published a thoughtful essay January 7th, 2025 in Foreign Affairs, The Strange Triumph of a Broken America. Why power abroad comes with dysfunction at home. And this is an ongoing theme on the show that Kip in particular likes to hammer on, is that it's undeniable since the 1960s we have seen a steady decline in the quality of life in the United States. simultaneously, over the past 15 years, we have seen a steady growth of America's power and economic and military might compared to other superpowers. So why do we have such a broken America at home and declining quality of life, while at the same time the United States is on a trajectory to be even more powerful in the world vis-a-vis our greatest rivals, right? 2/3 of Americans believe the country is on the wrong track. 70% rate the economy is not good. Public trust in government has fallen by half in just the last 25 years, from 40% to 20%. Love of country is fading. For me, the Obergefell decision, legalizing gay marriage in all states, just dealt a sucker punch, stomach punch, blow to my gut as far as my feelings about the United States. And I've heard Orthodox rabbis saying that it would be preferable for Jews to live under Putin's Russia, right? To live in Putin's Russia because it doesn't have same-sex marriage. That from several perspectives within Orthodox Judaism, living in a country with same-sex marriage is a very big problem. That once a country sanctifies same-sex marriage, that is such an astronomical level of degradation and moral pollution that it is spiritually unsafe for Jews to live in such a state. The Talmud, for example, has very few compliments to pay the Romans, but one of the compliments it does pay the Romans is at least they didn't have same-sex marriage. Okay, congressional polarization. We got threats of violence that is against politicians surging. Donald Trump faced 2 assassination attempts en route to reclaiming the White House. He won the popular vote, even though many Americans believe he's a fascist. We got scholars drawing parallels between the U.S. and Weimar Germany. Others liken the United States to the Soviet Union in its final years. Yeah, only clowns like Neil Ferguson. I can't think of anyone else making this argument. A brittle gerontocracy rotting from within. I don't think that's anywhere close to an accurate description of the United States. And you've got all sorts of clowns arguing that the United States is on the brink of a civil war. Right? That's very attention-grabbing. I don't think it has any basis in reality. But if you're on talk radio or you're on live streams, right, you're fighting for people's attention and claiming that we're on the brink of a civil war, we're on the brink of creating another Auschwitz, or we're on the brink of becoming Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. I understand why that's attention-grabbing, but it's also moronic, and I've got nothing but contempt for that attention-grabbing strategy and the people who employ it. Now, all this undeniable American dysfunction has had remarkably little effect on America's power, and I think one thing that non-Americans don't understand is that government, the way it was set up by our founders, is not nearly the same smooth process that you get in Westminster systems, in parliamentary systems. Right? So government in the United States is awkward, and there are many different power centers, and it's never going to be as smooth as you see in most parliamentary systems, but that doesn't mean it's not effective. All right, the country's share of global wealth has dramatically increased. It's surged over the past 15 years. America's grip on global arteries such as energy, finance, markets, and technology is getting stronger. The U.S. is gaining allies. Its main adversaries, China and Russia, are losing allies. Right, so overall, compared to the other great powers, the United States is in great economic and demographic shape. So this is the paradox of American power. The United States is a divided country, perpetually seen as in decline. So I moved to the United States in 1977, and certainly since 1977, it has been a major article of intellectual discourse that the United States is in decline. Because my father first came to the United States in the 1950s. He did a master's degree and a PhD in the U.S. in 1950s, and after World War II, the United States produced the vast majority of manufactured goods in the world. So during the 1950s, America had just an unbelievable level of global dominance. So you're probably wondering, what does Neil Ferguson and what do Stephen Kotkin have to say about this? But most importantly, What about Dan Turrentine and Sean Spicer?
Let's play clip number 2, how the media has reacted to J.D. Vance's comments, and our friends at CBS have really stepped in it.
Well, he was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide. And he met with the head of a political party that has far-right views and some historic ties to extreme groups. The context of that was changing the tone of it. And you know that the censorship was specifically about the right.
No, I have to disagree with you.
That is a terrible phrasing of a question, right? The best questions are the shortest. So I was just meeting Michael, right, talking to him for the first time. So I was a little lengthier. I was using more preambles. But as you know, in most of my conversations here, when I'm not sharing an opinion, when I'm conducting an interview, I try to make my questions as short and as clear and as open as possible, right? I don't tend to ask yes/no questions. What an awful phrasing of a question there by Margaret Brennan. Ugh.
Free speech was not used to conduct a genocide. The genocide was conducted by an authoritarian Nazi regime that happened to also be genocidal because they hated Jews and they hated minorities and they hated those that they had a list of people they hated, but primarily the Jews. There was no free speech in Nazi Germany. There was none. There was also no opposition in Nazi Germany. They were a sole and only party that governed that country. So that's not an accurate reflection of history. I also think it's wrong. Again, I go back to the point of his speech. Okay, the point of his speech was basically that there is an erosion in free speech and intolerance or opposing points of view within Europe, and that's of concern because that is eroding. That's not an erosion of your military capabilities. That's not an erosion of your economic standing. That's an erosion of the actual values that bind us together in this transatlantic union that everybody talks about. And I think allies and friends and partners that have worked together now for 80 years should be able to speak frankly to one another in open forums without being offended, insulted, or upset. And I spoke to foreign ministers from multiple countries throughout Europe. Many of them probably didn't like the speech or didn't agree with it, but they were continuing to engage with us on all sorts of issues that unite us. So, again, at the end of the day, I think that people give all that is a forum in which you're supposed to be inviting people to give speeches, not basically a chorus where everyone is saying the exact same thing. That's not always going to be the case when it's a collection of democracies where leaders have the right and the privilege to speak their minds in forums such as these.
So I'm just looking at Fox News right now. Elon Musk damages his credibility so often with reckless pronouncements. All right, if you just hire a fact checker before he says crazy things on X, right, just imagine that he cared about his credibility, right? Just imagine that he employed a staff to fact check what he wanted to post in advance, right? What a stronger position he'd be in. It boggles my mind how awful he is so often on social media.
Mr. Secretary, I'm told that we are out of time.
Just talked about, which is they're focusing on how he got their attention and not really the what, because obviously some of what J.D. Vance, her criticism is similar to what you heard of Trump in 2015 and 2016. This is far right. This is extreme. It shouldn't be given oxygen, but it turned out there were a lot of Americans who saw it very differently and were less kind of focused on Trump's style and more focused on the issues that he was raising, and now, they are primarily mainstream. So, Sean, what say you of Margaret Brennan and the way some of the media has reacted to J.D. Vance's speech?
Yeah. So 4 quick points. One, I thought Marco Rubio continues to demonstrate how eminently qualified he is for this position and what a great pick he was. He is articulate, well-versed in history. I couldn't be more pleased with President Trump's choice on this. 2, there's a broader discussion to be had on the issue of free speech. I've always said this before, free speech in its ultimate form is allowing that which you detest. I've used the example before. I find flag burning the ultimate disgusting act. But if you embrace the First Amendment and free speech, you have to allow what you hate. You have to defend that. I
don't view flag burning nor pornography as a matter of free speech. It is an action, right? It's not, to me, it's not a matter of free speech. I think the U.S. Supreme Court took a wrong turn when their rulings on pornography were on the basis of free speech. All right, there's free expression and there is free speech. Right, I am not for unlimited free expression I am for close to unlimited free speech. And so I am much more open to criminal penalties for burning the flag. I'm not pushing them. I haven't thought deeply about the matter, but I don't equate free expression with free speech. I think it's a major error.
That is the ultimate goal of free speech. Number 3, CBS is at best in a spiral downward of epic proportions. This comment by Margaret Brennan follows on the heels of 60 Minutes, the lawsuit, them discussing and suppressing free speech in a separate segment. They've had some issues with their morning show. They've covered how they've covered Israel. I mean, so that's number 3. Number 4, with respect to what Margaret Brennan said, she said that free speech weaponized was what allowed the Holocaust to exist. You know, Dan, when I was at the White House, I had probably one of the most epic screw-ups in my life. And in an attempt to explain something unbelievably poorly, I made a reference that I'll never, ever live down. And it was a fumble. Like, it was the biggest screw-up, like just how I articulated and what I was intending to do. I think everybody understood what I was intending to do to describe the horrendous nature of what Assad had done in Syria. And I screwed up an analogy and a historical reference. And I paid an ultimate price for this. And to watch Margaret Brennan walk out last night and not say a word, she goes, "We're out of time." CBS has said nothing. Her colleagues at CBS have said nothing. No one is calling her out. These so-called, Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty, who are rushed to condemn everybody on the right. Where are they today? Why is Margaret Brennan facing no backlash from her colleagues in the media? This is absolutely reprehensible. The hypocrisy in the media continues to go unchecked. Caitlin Collins over the weekend tweets out the legal defense fund of Luigi Mangione, the guy who killed the CEO of United Healthcare. No matter what you think of this, raising money for a killer. And no one at CNN saying a word. I mean, whether it's Margaret Brennan or CBS or Caitlin Collins at CNN, the impunity to which these folks go out there and do things that are unbelievably reprehensible with no consequence is gone too far.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'll just say, because I see it in the chat, some people are like, how could we defend what J.D. Vance did? Look, I think, as is often the case with stuff, political parties have their fringes, and they have people that say certain things. I don't think anyone, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, is speaking on behalf of people who deny the Holocaust. I think what J.D. Vance was trying to do was say, look, some of the parties that you label as fringe, that you are trying to shut down, some of the issues that they are speaking to remind J.D. Vance and others a lot of what the right went through in America, which is immigration and people crossing their borders and the stagnant economy. And so when what they focused on is that some of the parties that he met with, some of what they've had to say is not, makes you cringe. But I think the bigger picture was, it was kind of this, the MAGA, principles they're now starting to push in Europe and saying, you need to, we are going to give voice to the frustrations of these people. And I think it does kind of go to this question of this emerging Trump foreign policy, which is, on the one hand, if you want our help, you're going to give us something. And if you don't have anything of note, to give us, like in Ukraine, they said, okay, we want half the minerals. It's a little, it's jarring. I read one analogy that said this is a little bit like colonialism, where it's like, we're going to take some stuff from you because we're helping you out. Look, Sean, to me, the issue is, at some point, we have to do favors for friends. Like, you can only have a deal if it's a two-way deal. The other side has got to get something out of the relationship. My dating history, like, good luck telling your partner it's always going to be the way I want it, my way or the highway.
So I was sued 5 times during my blogging career, and I was glad that there was this avenue available for people who objected to what I was writing online, because the alternative is that they'd hire someone to break my legs. And for Trump supporters who are appalled by impeachment, recognize that if there was no impeachment mechanism available, then people would much more readily take to the final solution for a president who they detested. So be glad that there are avenues such as filing a defamation lawsuit, filing lawfare, filing articles of impeachment, right? So much superior to the alternatives.
At some point, Trump's going to have to show some openness to, like, let us do you some solids here. But
Dan, you admit there's a difference. This is my point on two fronts. One is, like, the free speech argument. You're absolutely right. For those of us on the right, like, this idea of democracy dies in darkness, which is the new tagline of the Washington Post since Trump got elected, is an attempt to embrace the freedom of speech. And yet, to people on the left, freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of is what we want to talk about. So the idea of, the censorship and blocking people, like, that's not free speech. And this idea of saying, look, you've got to allow voices that you don't like. There was a comment one of the members of Congress, I played it on my show, from I'm trying to remember what state she's from, and she said, I'll stand with anyone who wants to limit free speech. And it's like, wait a second. So there's a bigger, broader discussion, not just here in this country, but internationally, especially in Europe, about some of the laws. And if you saw, like, there was a clip that's now gone viral on 60 Minutes, I'll play tonight on the show, where these guys talk about the fact in Europe, insulting someone is grounds for jailing them, right? And so insulting them. Listen, if that was the case, half of America would go to jail for what they've said about me. But so there's a discussion about free speech. Then secondly, there's a discussion about how we conduct ourselves. And I think at some point, and I get your point, doing a solid for someone, whether it's a neighbor figuratively or...
So I side much more with Sean Spicer in politics, but it's worth asking, why does Dan Turrentine have such a more likable personality? Why does he have such a more socially effective personality? One, he doesn't interrupt. Two, he really leans over backwards, to be fair. Many people on the right say he's their favorite Democrat because Dan really does strive to be fair, and he's just so superior to that Tim bloke who preceded him on the morning meeting, who would never admit to any bad news for the Democrats or any problems for the Democrats, just always spinning, just constantly losing credibility. And Dan is just so even-tempered and nice and pleasant, great smile, and it's worth just noting how does Dan have this more socially effective and likable personality?
Or a neighbor to like our north or whatever is one thing. Getting taken advantage of or not looking for a good deal is quite another. And I think what Trump represents most broadly, both domestically and internationally, is a voice that says at some point you've got to wake up and fix your own. You can't just do the same thing over and over again and expect a different outcome. So we're going to start looking out for America.
Yeah. Well, and I'll just say on the free speech that it's a little rich with the AP fight, but we need to move on. So
no. And I think that's, but I will say this. I will give you the fact that is worth a discussion. And I would tell you guys, I don't often, this is Mike Allen in Axios today has a column that's specifically devoted to the AP and the situations they're going in and lays out the arguments of both sides in terms of what's happening. And so since I don't think we're gonna have time to get into it, but there is a compelling discussion about what's happening. And just because you don't allow someone into your office doesn't mean you're anti-free speech. I'll just leave it at that.
So we're going to move on now. There's a lot of talk about precedent.
Yeah, there is a great article on Axios right now, why Trump targets the AP. And it's not just for that trivial Gulf of America matter, right? It's a big picture, right? Conservatives, Republicans have many complaints about the AP style book, right? How it shapes political dialogue by favoring liberal words, liberal phrases, liberal concepts concerning, not gender, I hate the word gender, concerning sex, right? Gender, using the word gender implies that society constructs the difference between male and female. I'm more trad, bro. Genetics, biology decides male versus female. But the AP consistently sides with the left-wing perspective regarding sexual identity, gender, immigration, race, and law enforcement. Right? This is about the AP weaponizing language through their style book to push a partisan worldview in contrast with the deeply held beliefs of many Americans and people around the world. Yeah. So that's what it's about. So the AP, right, uses gender affirming care. All right, they use just they take the liberal perspective as the more accurate perspective consistently. All right, they're all down with gender affirming care, meaning what it does to kids. My mind boggles. The mutilation of children, the sterilization of children, and you call that gender affirming care? The AP capitalizes black, and they don't capitalize white. Many other forms of news media do the same thing. The AP won't use the term illegal immigrant. The language that they push is just so consistently left-wing. Now, they're not as left-wing as the New York Times and the Washington Post.
About what Trump is doing. He continues to move 100 miles an hour. Doge, the firing of different federal agency employees, In some instances now they're quickly rehiring people because they seem to, realize, oops, wait, we do need that person. But the Supreme Court agreed now, or a case has reached the Supreme Court on the president's power to fire the I think it's the Inspector General, kind of writ large. Obviously, Sean, there's your case of Spicer versus Biden in the Kennedy Center. Stepping out from each of these, the bigger picture here, the power, the executive branch power to kind of police itself. How do you see this?
Well, first, on the court front, I can't imagine. Look, there's a nuance in the inspector generals in particular. They're supposed to be given 30 days notice and have a material reason for firing them and notify Congress. So I could see in that case the court kind of trying to carve out a niche that says the president has the power to do that. But in this particular case, they might find some nuance that says, but he didn't follow the procedure. So we're saying that the president can do it. He needs to go back, give them 30 days notice and tell Congress he's firing. I could see a scenario where the court affirms that position. But the bottom line is, and I think Elon said this really well in the Oval the other day, at some point we elect at the head of the executive, the president.
So I have so many blind spots, particularly with regard to details about where people are at. And Kemendov says, Sean Spicer looks better now, but for some time since the DC crash, he has looked shaken, as if he was struggling to hold back tears, bloodshot eyes. I was completely oblivious to this, didn't notice this as well. Bob Holtberger, our European correspondent, says, it'll be funny if America and Russia declares that there's peace in Ukraine, but Europe insists that the war goes on. Then Ukraine will have the difficult choice of either relying on Europe, all right, or accepting the American-Russian deal.
See, the bureaucracy doesn't get to dictate what happens. We have an election, consequences happen, and if the president of the United States gets to shape the executive, that's just a fact, right? It's sort of like saying the Speaker of the House can't determine what bills come up on the floor of the House. You elect a speaker to perform certain functions, same way you elect a president to run the executive branch. So I have a feeling the court is going to affirm this, and that will go that. You mentioned the case. It was a really funny story. I wrote this op-ed. I mentioned this, a few weeks ago in the New York Post about Spicer v. Biden and why President Trump had all this power. And then this just tells you how funny this stuff is. In the course of the editing process, the New York Post editor says to me, what other commissions are there that this would, like, because maybe not everyone's familiar with Service Academy. And so I have a list of all the commissions and boards.
Okay, there is the Washington Post story. How did Trump so easily take over the Kennedy Center? Ask Sean Spicer. So Sean's got a great story. I'm going to get to that in a second. But, I've just been hammering on a fantastic essay published in the University of Minnesota Law School journal, Constitutional Dictatorship, Its Dangers and Its Design. So we've heard a lot of talk recently about the unitary theory of the executive. And so back from this 2010 essay published by two Yale law professors, is a little bit more. The constitutional theory of the unitary executive, which was much touted during the Reagan administration, is designed to preserve the president's formal ability to control, oversee, hold accountable all members of the executive branch. This theory began to gain currency after the work of the executive branch became so varied and specialized, following the most dramatic ideological shift in the White House since Roosevelt's replacement of Hoover in 1933. So talking about the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So for a long time, the vast majority of federal bureaucrats, including the most highly educated and powerful ones, have been on the left, generally with a negative predisposition to Republicans. So President Reagan's lawyers liked the theory of the unitary executive precisely because they felt, for good reason, that the administrative state was beyond their control, particularly with regard to civil service, protected holdovers from previous administrations that do not share Reaganites' ideological preferences. So the unitary executive theory arose during a period when the president and Congress were controlled by opposite parties. So defenders of a strong presidency viewed increased control over the bureaucracy as the best way to promote their policy goals without interference from opponents of the presidency. And these two Yale professors say the theory of the unitary executive is a convenient fiction offered by lawyers to allow presidents to consolidate power within increasingly complex administrations that necessarily feature multiple centers of power and sources of authority. So asserting that the president has control over the entire administration is a bit like the courtiers of King Canute, who tried to flatter him by claiming he could direct even the progress of the oceans. Is that true? Is that a useful analogy here? I'm skeptical of that claim. In practice, the president cannot effectively control many of the discretionary decisions made by lower-level officials. Okay, so in practice, nobody's got 100% control. Right? Even bosses often do not have 100% control. But it's a matter of what amount of control. The independent federal agencies, civil service protections prevent the president from immediately firing people who exercise discretion. Well, these can be changed. Right. So the theory or theoretical fiction, according to these Yale professors of the unitary executive, tries to deal with these realities in three ways. It denies that these realities exist. It uses the theory to consolidate power and avoid oversight. And it claims that other features like independent agencies are unconstitutional. So behind the rhetoric of the unitary executive is the reality of an increasingly disaggregated forms of power and expertise in the modern executive branch. So people on the left love the power of expertise. People on the right believe more in common sense, and they have much more skepticism with regard to expertise, and they want their elected representatives to have the power to control expertise. Now, the two Yale professors who write this essay are on the left. They say in the modern administrative state, unilateral decision-making power is distributed as often as it is concentrated in a single individual. I don't think we can argue with that assertion.
And I start reading off a list, like, oh, there's this, and they mention, oh, the Kennedy Center, everyone knows what that is. So I put that in the op-ed. Well, then when President Trump fires everyone at the Kennedy Center is asked, why are you not pushing back? And they say, on the record, because of Spicer v. Biden. Well, the reporter then from the Washington Post calls me and goes, do you realize that people are now citing your case as a reason why the President Trump has the authority to fire them? And I was like, no kidding. The Post reporter says, you didn't know that? And I'm like, it's not like I follow the Kennedy Center spokesman on Twitter or something. So he goes, oh my God, like he reads the course, I mean, the court stuff. He calls me back the next day and he said, you do realize how big this is. And we're now writing. So that precipitated that story that was on the front page of the style section on Saturday. But it's the thing that I found funny, Dan, and I normally don't do this, but I kind of wanted to, I was on a plane long enough that I wanted to, like, it's the equivalent of what do they call it, hate watching, but I hate read the comments. And all these people are like, this was so petty. Like what, first of all, what was petty? I didn't do this. Biden fired me. All I did was, go to court to say he didn't have the right to do that. The Biden administration argued in court through the appeals process that they had the absolute right to do this. And now everyone gets pissed that President Trump is using that as the precedent to do this. It would have never happened if Biden hadn't been as petty as he had. So I see this over and over again where everyone gets mad that President Trump is doing something when Biden started it. Like they're like, oh, he took away Biden's security clearance. Yeah, Biden did it to him. You can't get pissed at him for what he started.
Well, and that's, I think.
Okay, tell me more, 40, about the unitary executive theory and how Donald Trump might use it to transform the government. I am so glad you asked. CBS News says.
Trump has been back in office for just over 2 weeks, and he has already transformed.
So this is a report from 12 days ago.
The U.S. government. Since his inauguration on January 20th, the president has signed more than 36 executive orders. His administration has also ramped up ICE raids and migrant arrests, fired hundreds of federal employees, overhauled foreign aid, and implemented hefty tariffs on the United States' three largest trading partners, Mexico, Canada, and China. The tariffs, of course, on Mexico and Canada are on pause for the next month. But the president's moves have some lawmakers and government workers wondering whether all of this is legal. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson is here to help us answer that. She's a professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. So, Jessica, there's a conservative constitutional theory known as the unitary executive. What is it, and how might the Trump administration be utilizing it?
Well, it's the idea that the president is ultimately the one who has complete authority over the executive branch. And the most controversial part of this theory is the idea that the president has unfettered discretion to remove people who work for the executive branch. This is certainly an issue that is at the top of a lot of people's minds right now, particularly because, as you just clearly laid out, we are seeing a number of firings and or forced resignations. And the theory extends beyond just firing to issues like giving the president maximum authority without congressional interference to take care to faithfully execute the laws. But the area where we see the most litigation and likely the most movement right now is this idea that the president can fire who he wants to as long as they were an executive agency employee.
I want to dive into this further, but first off, how has the Supreme Court recently paved the way for this expansion of presidential powers?
Yeah, so in one case, a case that you and I got to talk about recently, the presidential immunity decision was obviously the Supreme Court showing a broad embrace of executive authority. And that was a case where the court said, for lack of a better way of describing it, we need to kind of bubble wrap the president. So when it comes to any decisions that the president makes that are official conduct, you are absolutely immune from criminal prosecution. Obviously, that isn't about hiring and firing, but it's part of this idea that the president is very powerful and deserving of protection. And it follows on a Nixon era decision where the court said when it comes to civil cases, and the president is sued based on official conduct, there is absolute immunity from civil liability. Another recent case dealt with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where the court, back to hiring and firing, said that part of how the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was structured, and specifically how the director could only be removed for cause, that actually violated the Constitution because the president, as head of the executive branch, should be able to more easily remove that director.
Jessica, we've been hearing a lot about DOGE and Elon Musk. Senator Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said the Department of Government Efficiency is neither a real government agency, nor does it have authority to make spending decisions and shut down government programs. So what legal authority does DOGE have? We know that Musk at least had a very vocal role in wanting to shut down USAID.
Well, I think that's right, vocal role. And what we've heard from President Trump, my interpretation is that he is getting recommendations from Elon Musk and the DOGE. But there is and or should be an understanding that the DOGE and Elon Musk cannot say, we are now going to fold USAID into the State Department, for instance. There are a lot of concerns about the amount of, or I should say, there's some concerns about the amount of access that DOGE has to financial information and potentially other sensitive information. But in terms of that department's ability to say, we are now reorganizing the executive branch, that's really not a decision they can make. And frankly, the bigger legal question is, can President Trump, by executive order, do things like try and reorganize USAID? I think there is some statute.
Okay, we're going to learn a lot more about the unitary theory of the executive and some excellent moments on this morning's meeting here with Sean Spicer. Mark Halperin was hosting the Smoke-On-ish show, so he wasn't on this morning.
The thing that I would just, highlight is what seems to be kind of we're inching toward is for the last 30 years, chief executive officers, the president, have increasingly been arguing that congressional restraints on how the executive branch kind of governs itself, how it polices and oversees itself. There are no constraints, right? It would be like the executive branch telling Congress, these are the rules for how you have to operate and how you can fire your own employees. And it seems to be that increasingly the courts are of, agreement. And we'll see with this.
Well, there's two issues here, right? There's the legal point that you're talking about. Do they have the right to do it? And then in some of these cases, like the Kennedy Center, it's the tradition, right? I don't know that anyone would have argued that the president can't appoint certain people. But what Biden did was.
All right, Stephen Miller, I think, is one of the most effective Trump spokesmen.
Can you give assurances to people who faithfully pay their taxes in this country? The DOJ isn't just going to go randomly sifting through the records and maybe come across the personal private records of a lot of Americans.
I can give absolute 100% assurance. I give you complete and total assurance on that point. We are talking about performing a basic anti-fraud review to ensure that people are not engaging in large-scale theft of federal taxpayer benefits. I mean, for example, we pay billions of dollars a year in child tax credit payments to illegal aliens. Billions with a B. So these are systematic, programmatic reforms that we're talking about here. And as far as protecting the secrecy of tax records, the IRS has been weaponized at the career level against the American people for years now. This has been one of the most invasive arms of the federal government, engaging in capricious and politically based audits, leaking taxpayer information for political reasons. We are restoring the neutrality. We are restoring ethics. We are restoring security controls at IRS. In fact, one of the big projects that DOJ is going to be working on is upgrading IT systems and software so that our taxpayer information cannot be stolen by criminals or foreign governments.
Okay, let's get back to some highlights from the morning meeting. Here we go.
Stupider.
Who's winning?
I put this in the chat. I think Republicans are having a contest to go on Face the Nation and see who can make Margaret Brennan look stupider.
Who's winning?
JD and Marco have a tie. I got to give the edge to Marco because what she said was just so. I don't even know if she's read a history book.
Can I ask you this, David?
The Nazis allowed too much free speech. Are you kidding me?
Wait, can I ask you this? So let me. By Friday, does Margaret Brennan still have a job? Yes or no?
Yeah, sure.
You think so?
You think that the bosses that she has looked at that and go, "Oh, that's the worst thing I've ever heard." Nah,
no, because their bosses are trying to get a merger done. I think they're a little more sensitive to what Trump administration may think.
Yeah.
David, did you have a question? Do you have a comment, or do you just wanted to?
No, it was. I mean, you guys go on these shows, and you go into green rooms, and you've done all this stuff. I mean, have you ever seen? I mean, I hate to rag on her so much, but have you ever seen anybody like this? Because I haven't. I mean, you can go to the debate, you can go to JD Vance, you can go to several other things, and it just seems that she doesn't know what she's talking about, and that's a pretty.
There is a weekly competition between Margaret Brennan and Kristen Welker, who can be worse, and that's a tough one right now.
I think the big challenge is with the media, with the mainstream media, is they still tend to focus on the how and not on the what. What was the kind of macro message of JD Vance to Europe? Instead, she focused on his tactics and, was trying to kind of like express outrage, which is not what a journalist is supposed to do, right? You want to kind of go to the substance, try to educate people about, why this is important, why this is worth, being in the news, instead of focusing on kind of your own personal feelings on the style of how it's done. And that, has been tripping up the mainstream media for 9 years. They don't like Trump's style.
Yeah.
To state the obvious.
Yeah. No, but one thing, I think that Kristen Welker, I mean, I agree with you, Sean. She's not great, but I think that she at least knows what she's talking about. I mean, she's being willfully ignorant or whatever when she's talking to Republicans. I just don't get the feeling that Margaret Brennan knows anything.
Well, I think
I don't know that it's an intelligence thing as much as it is a bias thing. I mean, I think that she just really doesn't like in a personal way. I mean, the animus. So that's the thing. When you watch a show like that, you can see somebody's animus. I mean, she just doesn't like them, and it's just blatant on television.
That's true because you watch her interview a Republican, and her hands are all over the place. She's doing this. She's like this. It's just, and then she's interviewing a Democrat, like who was it, Shaheen yesterday, and she's just like sitting back, well, yeah, that's amazing.
That's a good observation. Thank you, David. Thank you, Pat.
And I think I discovered you on Megyn Kelly.
Okay.
And I do like to follow American news as well. So I just came on because I wanted to react, if that's okay, following JD Vance's visit here in Germany to the security meeting. Because I know the press here in Europe in general, they're pretty much like the liberal press in America. So they kind of already hate him before you even start saying anything. But I think there is a movement, and a lot of people in America, left-wing in America, don't realize that even here in France, for example, the electorate, I would say, is about 44% to the right. If you look at all the parties, and I think a lot of people in America, and that's my question to Dan eventually. I just see that it seems like the left is really struggling to come to terms with the new reality, right? Because, for example, here in here in Europe, you have a massive migration that have happened since 2015. You know, remember with the war in Syria? I don't know if you remember that picture of that little boy who died. I think it was on a beach near Greece. It was horrific. And nobody is talking about the fact that even under the Obama administration, like the displacement of people and just the chaos that ensured that came because of that war. Germany took in 1 million people, and immediately they start having terrorist attacks. So I don't know whether the left actually realized what the impact of migration in Europe, or even in America for that matter. And I'm saying it as someone who's also himself eventually immigrated here in France. But you at some point, when you keep adding, and I see the same thing, for example, also in Chicago, you know, you have places that are already struggling, and you keep adding people. The infrastructure is not there to support the growth. And sadly, yeah, I don't know if the left, whether in America or in Europe, is ever going to self-correct. But it is going to be a problem. Just on the infrastructure issue.
Look, I think you make a very smart point, and I know some people in the chat here are kind of criticizing me for not being tougher on JD Vance. The reason that I'm a little more open-minded is the big picture. I agree with you. The Democratic Party completely missed the rising frustration over immigration, and that goes even into this summer when there was a famous MSNBC panel one evening where they basically tried to say that it was a joke that immigration was a top issue of voter concern and that it shouldn't be. And to state the obvious, there is no worse position in politics than telling a voter that what they think is basically stupid and shouldn't be what they think. Like, let me tell you what should be important to you. And I think in Europe, there is a similar kind of liberal sensibility that does not want to open the door that immigration is a problem. The working class has real concerns, whether it's cost of living or economic access or the strain on social services. And whatever I think, voters are increasingly with their feet making statements. And I think that's where JD Vance was like, you guys need to stop saying they're extreme and focusing on something else that they talk about. Germany obviously has laws about what you can and cannot say or advocate for regarding the Holocaust. That is a side issue, I think, is what Vance was saying. The big issue is you need to let these voices, don't fear them, right? Because it's on the march the way it was in the United States. So I think you're right. I think Democrats, need, and I think here we learned the lesson the old-fashioned way. We got our butts kicked.
Yeah, and I think even, I remember, is it last year that there were this riot in Ireland? And the main thing, I think the trigger was like, they also had, they took in a lot of people from Ukraine eventually. So I think a lot of people, if you speak to the elites, you only have the impression that those, like the entire country, the entire European country or the EU is fully behind Ukraine or the war in Ukraine. But it has caused so many problems. And I think the average everyday people realize that this thing cannot continue. It cannot go on. There are people today living in Germany following this, basically where they closed 3 nuclear power plants, and they had to go and find all the energy now in Russia. But there are people now in Germany, the largest economy in Europe, who are unable to heat their homes. And the situation is, it's really bad. And I think that the elites, sadly, I don't think that they understand the appetite that people have now to say, okay, we've done what we could. You've asked us to pay more taxes. We've done all of that. Now we just want to move on. We don't want to hear this defense of Ukraine, because eventually, what are you going to ask them to continue funding it up to which point? So anyway.
Let me just first,
John.
I'll make it quick, Anthony.
Yeah, great analysis there from base black guy in France, immigrant, but he has some empathy for the working class and populist perspective in Europe. And speaking of working class populist perspective, we haven't heard from Stephen J. James since I gave him an interview and then felt conflicted about it. And my God, I've lost my populist working class correspondent in the United Kingdom, Stephen J. James. Where have you gone, man? When you lose Stephen J. James, my God, What does that mean? Painful loss. All right, thoughtful essay here by one of my favorite academics, Michael Bailey, on the strange triumph of a broken America. All right, why does American power abroad come with so much dysfunction at home? Right, so America looks more dysfunctional than it is because its political system is not a smooth system like the Westminster parliamentary system. So the United States has enormous assets, right? Vast land, dynamic demographics, decentralized political institutions, and these assets also create liabilities. So the country is an economic citadel. It's packed with resources. It's blessed by ocean borders that shield it from invasion while connecting it to global trade. And America has more rivers than anywhere else on Earth where you can move goods. So the U.S. enjoys a growing workforce. It has about the hardest working population in the world and the most productive population in the world. And we have a decentralized political system. So we've got a dynamic private sector that innovates much faster than its competitors. So our politicians may fight, but we have all these structural advantages that keep the United States ahead of the game. Now, these same strengths, according to Bailey, also create some major vulnerabilities. They deepen the divide between the prospering urban hubs and struggling rural communities. So there are major economic disparities fueling political polarization. I don't think economic disparities are as important as the conventional wisdom, right? If you've got meaning and purpose in life, if you love your family, if you're part of a community, right, I don't think that you're getting eaten up by resentment over economic disparities. So our cities in America largely benefit from an increasingly globalized, knowledge-based economy powered by immigration. Many rural areas have been left behind as manufacturing and public sector jobs have dwindled. So this breeds resentments and fraying national unity. I think the resentment and the fraying national unity comes from primarily a declining quality of life, which is in large part produced by immigration and the civil rights industrial complex and all these government efforts to diversify when people's natural inclination is to find a community of people like themselves. Geographic insulation and wealth foster a sense of detachment from global affairs. Well, the United States is less vulnerable to trade fluctuations than any other major country. Now, Bailey says that we underinvest in military. We spend more money on military than every other nation in the world put together. He says that we underinvest in our diplomatic capabilities. So this tension between detachment and global engagement results in a hollow internationalism where the U.S. seeks to lead on the world stage but lacks the resources to fully achieve its goals, inadvertently fueling costly conflicts. Interesting. Would not have thought of this. So these vulnerabilities, domestic fragmentation, strategic insolvency, threaten America's stability and security, creating dualities. So we've got an economic boom coexisting with a civic bust. Yeah, I see that. But I see the civic bust reflects declining quality of life, the amount of crime, because we went easy on criminals since Black Lives Matter in Ferguson in 2014. We've got unmatched material strength squandered by a feckless foreign policy. Feckless, doesn't that mean weak? Feckless. Lacking initiative or strength of character. I don't see that. Trade and immigration enrich the country, yet strain its social fabric and devastating working class communities. Yes, so Trump's more protectionist trade policies should help our social fabric and help our working class. So the U.S. is an economic power, accounts for 26% of global GDP. Right, in 2008, the economies of the U.S. and the Eurozone were of approximately equal size. Now the American economy is twice as large as Europe. It is 30% larger than the combined economies of the so-called global South: Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. If the entire continent of Africa just sank into the ocean, right, American welfare would not be significantly diminished. A decade ago, it was just 10% larger. So we've gone from 10% to 30% larger in just a few years, right? The Chinese economy is shrinking relative to that of the United States. Right? China's economy is much smaller than the Chinese Communist Party claims. And so even with statistics where Beijing is inflating its numbers, all right, America's economy is booming and China's is collapsing. Right? Chinese citizens increasingly vote with their money and their feet. From 2021 to 2024, Chinese citizens illicitly moved hundreds of billions of dollars out of China. They became the fastest growing migrant group crossing the U.S. southern border, with their numbers surging 50-fold. I didn't know that. I didn't know that Chinese citizens were the fastest growing migrant group. Well, fastest growing, that's deceptive. But anyway, their numbers have surged 50-fold over this period. Remember in 2018, I was having all these debates with the chat and sometimes with guests that China was in decline, and they would tell me, no, America's in decline. China's unstoppable, bro. China's the most powerful nation on earth. They're just wiping the floor with America. No one comes on here and makes that argument anymore. Right? I got it right. I mean, there are plenty of things I got wrong, but it seems like I got that right. Right? China is collapsing vis-a-vis the United States. Russia is collapsing vis-a-vis the United States. U.S. is widening its lead in per capita wealth. So European economy is stuck. Japan's economy is stuck. Germany's economy is in decline. Russia's economy is okay. China's economy in decline. So in 1995, Japanese citizens were on average 50% wealthier than Americans. Today, Americans are about 50% wealthier than the Japanese. If Japan were a U.S. state, it would rank as the poorest state behind Mississippi, as would France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Right? When Americans go to Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, right, they are often stunned at the poverty, right? The shoddy housing, the much more reduced material circumstances of Europeans compared to Americans. All right, Americans work hard, and the wages that they earn go much further than in Europe. So the U.S., compared to other advanced first world economy, has energy that is at least half the price that everyone else has to deal with. So from 1990 to 2019, U.S. median household income rose 55%, and the bottom fifth saw a 74% gain. Right? Most advanced economies have suffered declining wages since COVID. U.S. real wages have kept rising. Americans feel like they're losing ground because of high housing and food prices, but the majority of Americans are wealthier than before the pandemic, with low-income workers seeing particularly strong gains. Since 2019, wages for the lowest paid decile, so the lowest 10%, have grown 4 times as fast as for middle earners and over 10 times as fast as for top earners. Interesting. American millennials earn roughly $10,000 more on average than previous generations did at the same age, adjusting for inflation, and are similarly likely to own their homes. Don't tell Kip, man. This is going to ruin his doomer perspective on America. Many U.S. middle-class households rank within the richest 1 to 2% of global income earners. So we've got enormous individual wealth, enormous sheer economic size. Unlike China and India, which are populous but poor, or Japan and Western European countries, which are small but wealthy, the United States combines scale with efficiency, generating unrivaled economic power. In the 19th century, China had the largest population and the largest economy in the world. Russia had the largest economy and population in Europe, but both were easily defeated by more efficient powers such as Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom in the 19th century. So the U.S. has economic weaknesses, but they are less severe than those of other major economies. I like Stephen Kotkin's perspective on the new Trump administration.
Is this hard power, soft power, economic power?
You ever seen World Wrestling Entertainment? You have this fantastic ability to mesmerize people's attention with this incredible show by a guy who's just nonpareil in his ability to attract people's attention. And so we got these characters, that's what they are, who are now sent over to institutions to be the nominal head of them. But somebody's got to run the government. We need a budget. When was the last time the United States actually had a budget?
Sometime in the 1970s, I would guess.
It's been a really long time. We don't have one this year, and the next year budget is coming. I believe the cliff is in March, potentially, for the government running out of money. So, first of all, we need a government. That means we need a functioning Congress. We need a budgetary process. I understand the show, the WWE, and it's remarkable how amazing it has been in terms of ratings, in terms of knocking everybody else out of the people's attention span. And I know some of the characters are fabulous in terms of their face paint and costumes. But I'm looking for competence. I'm looking for follow-through. I'm looking for the ability to actually get things done. I know that you can break a lot of stuff. I've studied revolution for too long. What happens when you break things is when you try to rebuild, you're rebuilding with the shards of what you broke. And often, unwittingly, you rebuild what you think is something new, but is actually the old system. We all have read Tocqueville on the old regime in the French Revolution. So I get it that you can hate hard leftist cultural politics. You can see USAID as a practitioner of that self-defeating hard left cultural politics, which undermines American power in the world rather than enhances it. I get that. I get that they don't care about the fiscal health of the United States. Neil cares. John cares. Bill, myself, we all care. The voting public cares at a certain level. I'm not sure the people who are attacking the political hard left policies of government units care that much about this. The experience of Twitter is quite sobering in terms of value creation as opposed to transformation of the political spectrum there. I'd love for them to care about the stuff that John Cochran and Neil write about. We'll see. The rubber's going to hit the road with the budget. We're going to see what happens with stock markets. We get a 20% plus correction in the stock market. Correction is a euphemism. We get some inflation. We get some world events. And we'll see how much of this WWE can continue in the same vein going forward. Sure, let's knock off USAID. Let's knock off the Department of Education if they go after that next. Let's knock off all the things that conservatives have had a bee in their bonnet about for a while. But I need not just a smaller government. I need a better performing government. I need a government that not only does less, but what it actually does, it does well. And so rooting out certain...
So Stephen Kotkin is a conservative. He's a National Review type conservative.
Political tendencies, as John eloquently put it. I see that as understandable, desirable, necessary, but I need a lot more than that. I need Neil's vision of a full correction of the fiscal insanity, but who is going to do that, and how are they going to do that? And how are they going to do that when they've gone after things and spent their political capital on USAID? Once you run through a bunch of political capital and your approval ratings never hit 50% and begin to decline because some things you target are popular with some people, even if the overall targeting makes sense, I'm concerned that you blow your wad on little things that make you feel good and the big stuff that's really hard. When does that happen?
But isn't there a kind of tension between your views here? Steve, on the one hand, America's powerful, and it's powerful regardless of politics. On the other hand, the politics disturbs you. And it seems to me that this is really how we can resolve our debate. That in the end, we can go back to the Enlightenment for guidance here, since all the good ideas were had in Scotland in the 18th century. And the observation would be, yes, there are all these sources of dynamism. There are great reserves of energy. There's the ability to import talent. But if the institutions of the Republic have become WWE, then there's a distinct risk that some version of Ferguson's law kicks in. Or maybe it's Smith's law. Maybe the laws of economics will take their revenge because protectionist policies, John would argue, are bound ultimately to be self-defeating. And my sense is that what's very interesting about the historical process is that you can have all the things that Steve describes, and yet if your political institutions malfunction, you'll end up self-sabotaging. Now, I can't really tell at this early stage, 3 weeks in, if WWE is going to be the dominant feature of the new administration, or if one looks behind the wrestling and behind the face paint, there's actually a serious attempt to redress some of the mistakes of the previous administration. Let me take a positive line of argument, that behind the memes, there's in fact significant progress towards a reordering of the Middle East. Israel surprised everybody with its victories over Hamas and Hezbollah. It's actually gained a huge amount of ground with the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, and Iran is at its mercy. And at some point this year, that may well lead to a decisive move against Iran's nuclear facilities, which the US will quietly allow to happen and tacitly support. I'll carry on being positive. Everybody thought Ukraine was going to be handed by President Trump on a plate to Putin. That isn't happening. On the contrary, it seems to me that Ukraine has a decent shot.
So bloody European, our European correspondent Bob Altberger keeps coming up with some commonsensical and cutting insights, right? Isn't Trump earning political capital on USAID? Man, Mr. Altberger, he's got a gift. I mean, yeah, he's a deeply flawed individual. I mean, he's had a lot of, moral turpitude in his life, but damn, I mean, this bloody European, for whom English is not his first language, I mean, he could just cut to the chase. And I know, I know he's a deeply flawed man, and I'm embarrassed when I think about some of the things that he's done and the ways he's acted while intoxicated, and I recognize all the formidable criticisms of Mr. Altberger, but damn, he just brings it. He just brings it. I gotta tip my yarmulke to this guy, Bob Altberger. Who knew that he would turn out to be so incisive and cutting and such a valuable member of our community? After all that moral turpitude that just boggles the mind. One of my favorite memories of poli-sci class is I started taking classes from Larry White, who I just adored, and I was obnoxious. I have not always exhibited good judgment, and my ADHD would get out of control. And so I would say things in class that were disruptive and impolite. And so Larry gave me a B the first time I took a class with him on American politics, even though I richly deserved an A grade. But I so loved Larry White, I kept taking classes. And second class I took from him, when he's coming in the first day, he looks at me and he says, Mr. Ford, I thought you'd been arrested on some morals charge. That's one of my fondest memories. I mean, a bloke really likes you, no homo, when he insinuates that you've been arrested on a morals charge, right? That's when you know this is a bloke who truly cares about me. I mean, I don't know how many times our correspondent Kip has been arrested on charges of moral turpitude, but I'm not going to get into that. American dysfunction's had little effect on American power. This is Michael Beckley, one of my favorite academics. Right, he published a book on how China's falling apart, and then he published a book on the case for defending Taiwan. And here he's got an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine. The U.S. has expanded its military alliances, its control over financial systems, energy markets, consumer bases, technological development, increases its ability to shape the system in which other countries must operate. So which quality goods, right, which Chinese consumer goods do you most associate with China, right? There are none. Yeah, that dude knew Luke's dark proclivities. I have 2 books by Stephen Kotkin that I haven't read. Stalin, Paradoxes of Power, Stalin, Waiting for Hitler. So he's got a 3rd and final volume coming out on Stalin. It's the World War II years and beyond. I can't wait to read it. He's a terrific writer, Stephen Kotkin, and really enjoyed his books on Stalin. He even merited a selection in the Kevin Michael Grace Book Club. So consider the dollar, right? The US dollar accounts for 60% of global central bank reserves, right? Little down from 68% in 2004, but the same as in 1995. US dollar is used in 70% of cross-border banking liabilities and foreign currency debt issuance. which is up from 2004. The dollar accounts for 90% of global foreign exchange transactions. So because of the US dollar's dominant role, Washington gets to impose sanctions, secure lower borrowing costs, and bind other countries' fates to its own. Foreign government holdings of large dollar reserves are vested in a system which the economic health of the United States underpins their prosperity, and that makes them hesitant to take actions such as currency devaluations or sanctions that could harm America and also their own interests. I need to read these books by Stephen Kotkin. They are so giant, I keep putting out, bro, put it on Audible and then just let it run all night. That's what I do with my books, right? I just let them run on Audible all night, and I come in and out of sleep. But man, I get through so many books that way. U.S. energy transformation has bolstered Washington's global influence. U.S. used to be the world's largest energy importer. It's now the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, surpassing Russia and Saudi Arabia. Simultaneously, U.S. has adopted energy efficiency and renewable technologies, bringing per capita carbon emissions down to levels not seen since the 1910s. Energy boom has kept U.S. oil and gas prices low. All right, we got the cheapest energy in the world among advanced economies. All right, European companies pay 2 to 3 times as much for electricity, 4 to 5 times as much for natural gas. Right, many foreign manufacturers are relocating to the United States to tap that cheap energy. Right, they can't wait to tap our cheap energy. Right, you love sluts, right? You love sex and energy on the cheap. Come to America. Energy production helps Washington insulate itself and its allies from foreign coercion. Right, Russia invades Ukraine. U.S. helps Europe, heavily reliant on Russian energy, make up for its shortfall by sending Europe oil and gas. The huge American consumer market, which is equivalent to China's consumer market and the EU's consumer market combined, right? So the huge American consumer market pressures foreign companies and governments to align with U.S. trade policies to maintain access to the world's most lucrative revenue source, right? Companies all around the world want to tap our consumers. Right? It's the largest revenue source in the world, and they want to tap, tap, tap. Now, critics such as Mr. Kipp say, oh, 40, the U.S. is a house of cards. Its towering strength masks a faltering foundation. You've got government gridlock. You've got widespread pornography on the internet. You've got eroding public trust. You've got deepening social fissures. You've got cracks spreading through our civic bedrocks. Right? This is going to undermine the pillars of U.S. wealth and power. But U.S. history shows no straightforward link between internal turmoil and geopolitical decline. Yes, quality of life has dramatically declined for Americans since the 1950s, since the 1980s. But there's no straightforward link between quality of life and international power. So why is America so resilient? Like you say, 40, why are you so resilient? I watch the streams. You have this mesmerizing, incredible power to just let go of everything that you think you know. And I notice that you start to move in upward direction, that your breath comes easier, that your back starts to lengthen and widen as you let go of all your resentments and fears. You move into the present moment. You're in a state of awareness rather than judgment. Right? 40, why so resilient? Why is America so resilient? It's our structural strengths, bro. It's our geography. All right? It's our essence. It's our essence that keeps us strong. I don't disdain women, mate, but I do deny them my essence. Right? We are an economic hub. We're a military fortress. Right? I have abundant psychic resources. America has abundant resources. We've got plentiful, natural, navigable rivers. We've got deep water ports, bro. We've got low production costs. We've got a vast national market. Right? We can easily reach the wealthiest parts of Asia and Europe via ocean highways. Right? We're protected from foreign threats. Our military can roam abroad while enhancing the country's appeal as a safe haven. Capital tends to flow into America during global crises, even when the crises are made in America. This is Michael Bailey publishing in Foreign Affairs magazine in early January 2025. The U.S. attracts human capital, right? We get the smartest people. The most ambitious Australians tend to move to America, right? The most ambitious scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs move to America. So, yeah, we've got way too much immigration of low-skilled workers. That depresses wages in some sectors, right? So construction wages are basically the same as they were in Southern California as they were in the early 1960s. I moved from Australia, went back to Australia for a year after high school, where I had a cleaning and gardening contract where I was earning about $25 an hour American at age 18. Moved back to California. The only jobs I could land were at about $4 an hour. All right, back to Michael Bailey. So we've got, yeah, we pay low wages in some sectors, but that enables us to have industries such as retail, food service, agriculture, and healthcare operating with relatively low wages, makes them more economically efficient. And we could keep on keeping on during supply chain disruptions and public health crises. We got higher birth rates than other advanced economies. So the Chinese population of workers between the ages of 25 and 49 is going to drop by 74% by the end of this century. Germany by 23%, India 23%, Japan by 44%, Russia by 27%. Our prime working age population is going to grow throughout this century. While the U.S. political system seems gridlocked, right? The American political system is a federalized system. It is decentralized. You have authority spread out across federal, state, and local levels. And so we've got a workforce that is more educated than those of China, Japan, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Right, we have had a constitutional system from the beginning of the United States. We have a maximum of liberty. We have limited government. The mainstream media focuses on presidential horse races, but it overlooks the dynamism of local economies and the private sector. The United States is basically at the top consistently in innovation, in the ease of doing business. We have about the most productive workforce in the world. It takes about half the time to register property and enforce contracts compared with European countries. Americans start businesses at about 3 times the rate of France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Russia, and 1.5 times the rate of China and the United Kingdom. Americans work 25% longer than the Germans. Jawohl! Produce 40% more output per hour than Japanese workers. Right? American workers are 40% more productive on average than Japanese workers. Americans are able to hire and fire more frequently, more easily, more productively than any other major labor force. The U.S. bounced back from COVID much more rapidly than any other advanced economy. Right? We bounced back to pre-pandemic levels of employment by 2022. Right? Our average unemployment rate 4%, while for the G20 it lingers at 7%. So we are excellent at adopting and scaling innovations across industries. Compared with other advanced economies, American businesses face far fewer constraints from central government red tape. We have federal agencies that set broad guidelines, but we allow states to tailor regulations to local needs. We have a federal system, so states and cities can experiment with different approaches and they can compete for investment. Successful ideas spread more quickly in the United States. We have deep venture capital markets that account for about half the global total. We have close partnerships between businesses and universities. The U.S. hosts 7 of the world's top 10 universities and a quarter of the top 200. We gain more from new technologies than even the countries that invent them. Yes, the United Kingdom developed the steam engine, but the Americans applied it more extensively. In factories, railroads, and agriculture, we created the American system of mass production, and so the U.S. economy flashed past the United Kingdom in the 1870s, right? The United States has effectively been the world's dominant economic power since the 1880s. we've occupied at least 25% of global manufacturing output and GDP since the 1880s. So the US is still the most innovative. Right? China's subsidy-driven authoritarian model creates isolated pockets of innovation without enhancing productivity across the economy. So China prioritizes what it thinks are important sectors, such as electric vehicles and renewable energy, but these two industries make up only 3.5% of the Chinese economy. And they have bloated property and construction sectors, which account for 30% of their GDP and have erased 18 trillion in household wealth since 2021. Chinese tech industries fail to create sufficient jobs for millions of recent college graduates, leaving nearly 1 in 5 young adults unemployed. And the costs of China's subsidy-heavy model are enormous. The electric vehicle sector received $231 billion in subsidies since 2009. And not terribly innovative. Heavy regulation, political crackdowns further stifle innovation in China. New tech startups have dropped from over 50,000 in 2018 to just 1,200 by 2023. China's high-tech revenues are just a fraction of those in the United States. So you're probably saying, 40, share with me what Neil Ferguson has to say.
At a ceasefire, probably not a peace, that leaves it intact and allows it to be the South Korea of Eastern Europe. So maybe behind the wrestling and the face paint, there is a grand strategy, and it will turn out to be as good as the Reagan administration's turned out to be in the 1980s. We don't know. It's 3 weeks in. But the question is, if you're right, it is just wrestling and face paint, how far can in 4 years a republic sabotage itself? That's the key question. I'm optimistic. I actually thought the last administration did immense amounts of harm to American credibility, more or less bungled deterrence in every major theater. But I come back to the problem of Taiwan. In the end, Gaza is a trivial issue compared with Taiwan, an island that China says is its, which we more or less acknowledge it is, but which produces nearly all the most sophisticated semiconductors, more than 95% of those that you need to do AI at scale. If China blockades or quarantines Taiwan, doesn't need to invade it, it throws down a gauntlet to the United States, which seems to me very, very hard for the United States not to pick up. And I'm concerned that in that scenario, this administration is going to find itself with an impossible dilemma. The choice will be between World War III or capitulation. There won't be much in between. How do you think about that, Steve? Because it seems to me American power is going to be tested at some point by China in the way that British power was tested by Germany. We might prevail, but at such a cost that it might be very, very hard to maintain the kind of power that you talked about at the beginning.
We're tested now. Our adversaries are testing us across the board now and have been for some time. We've been in this so-called hybrid war or gray zone since before.
So there have been moments when I felt outraged that Stephen Kotkin hasn't completed his third volume of his trilogy on Joseph Stalin. But I have to give the guy a legitimate excuse. He has twice been diagnosed with cancer over the past few years. So there you go.
Goodfellas started, but certainly all throughout your Goodfellas. But here's the other part that we need to take into consideration, including to your challenge. How's China doing? They have infiltrated our telecommunications network. They exfiltrated tens of millions of personnel files. They cornered the market on drone manufacturing and batteries that we're dependent on. All the things that you know and write about. And yet, there's a lack of confidence there that runs really, really deep. They're afraid of their own people. Every day is existential for that system. The anti-corruption purges have increased, not decreased, even though Xi Jinping's been in power for more than a decade. And that immobilizes a lot of people. Taking initiative is dangerous in China. Sticking your head out, doing anything is dangerous in China. Reading the signals is really hard. No communist system has survived political liberalization. There's no reform equilibrium for a communist party regime. It either has a monopoly or it's done. They open up the system to have debate inside the party, and people say, you know what, I'd like another party. And the communists say, oh, no, 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 we're having pluralism inside the Communist Party monopoly.
It's like California, really.
Yeah, exactly. We know how that works. And so their ability to succeed domestically, but also foreign adventures, is not.
All right, excellent comment in the chat again from that damn Bob Moral Turpitude Outburger. Nobody is stopping Russia, China, or Europe from having a world reserve currency. Problem is, nobody trusts them. Yeah. Okay, you're saying, 40, stop with the small talk. I want to hear more of the insights from Michael Beckley. Like, what's going on, really? Why do we have this strange triumph of the United States that appears so distracted and troubled internally, but so dominant around the world? United States geographic, demographic, political advantages create another vulnerability. Tendency to pursue global interests without committing sufficient resources to prevent conflict. Really, is it our business to prevent conflicts overseas? Why not just let foreigners go at it? Americans overlook global affairs because oceans shield their country from foreign threats and because the U.S. economy is largely self-sufficient. So allow foreigners to go at it. Structure of American power creates competing pressures for detachment and engagement. I think the detached attitude. No, I'm not gonna weigh in there. Hollow internationalism led the U.S. to neglect deterrence. The world now faces converging threats. China is carrying out the largest peacetime military build-up since Nazi Germany. Russia is waging Europe's biggest war since World War II. We're settling that, bro. This was published before Trump spoke to Putin. Since the Soviet Union's collapse, experts have urged policymakers to prepare for multipolarity. But reality has taken a different course. The U.S. remains economically dominant while other contenders, adversaries, and allies are slipping into long-term decline. Shrinking population, stagnant productivity are eroding the strength of Eurasian powers. In the long run, a world without rising powers could foster stability by reducing the risk of hegemonic wars. Several threats loom. Declining powers such as China may resort to desperate wars to reclaim what they believe are lost territories, such as Taiwan, and avoid slipping permanently into second-tier status. Another threat is rampant state failure, particularly in debt-ridden countries, but that doesn't affect American welfare. A spiral of state failure could magnify a third threat, the continued rise of anti-liberalism in democratic countries. I don't worry about that. But Michael Beckley does. The U.S. might lean towards protectionism and xenophobia. I don't worry about that. The nativist turn might yield short-term gains for Americans, but would ultimately hurt them by making the world they inhabit poorer and less secure. I don't worry so much about nativism and xenophobia. Most immediate danger is that the United States will convince itself that it lacks the will or the capacity to counter large-scale aggression, but that's abroad. So what do we care what foreigners do to each other? So Michael Beckley wants a more internationally engaged United States to stand up against military aggression from Russia and China. Bro, I don't really care that much.
Home state of Vermont, they're trying to eliminate grades for students in secondary school. And I asked him, why are they trying to eliminate grades? And I said, is there the obvious example or case, is it sort of racial inequalities? And he said, no, Vermont is 98% white. Like, they're like, it's all white kids at the schools, but they're still trying to eliminate grades. And I asked, well, why do you think that is? And he says, that's just the mindset now.
Ashley St. Clair posted on X, of all platforms, the platform that Elon Musk owns, that she had had a child, she says, with Elon Musk. He has not denied it. It seems to be true. His 13th child, we believe. Mm-hmm. And I thought the reaction of different conservative commentators was quite interesting. Mm-hmm. You had the kind of Christian right saying, this is great, this is wonderful. Then you had other parts of the Christian right saying, hang on a second, what happened to traditional family values? Should we be happy about the fact that Elon Musk is sort of seemingly procreating at will? There's something going on there, isn't there, with kind of social conservatism effectively is not a force in American politics anymore. Nobody cares about, or very few people care about Elon Musk's private life who like Donald Trump.
Yeah. I mean, well, first, it's great to be here, Freddie. And yeah, I've been keeping up with the unfolding drama on X, and I've seen this covered in various outlets of this arrangement that Elon has with 13 different children with, I believe, 4 different women. Well, Elon has never called himself a conservative, to my knowledge, and I don't even know if Trump has, but it does feel like there's a shift in the Republican Party where the two most famous members of the party, the president and Elon Musk, are, they are not necessarily known for being sort of those classic traditional social conservatives, devoted fathers and family men and those kinds of things, marriages and divorces and children with different partners and so on. And, as I was reading about this and thinking about it, to me, it seems like we're just generally, shifting from, I did my PhD in psychology, and I take sometimes an evolutionary psychological lens to these things. And I think to myself, well, historically and cross-culturally, it's often been the case that very high status men do have multiple partners, multiple children with different partners, and sometimes culturally we can contain that impulse in elite men. And I think we've done this somewhat successfully. In the modern era, 13 children is a lot of children.
Do you know which men tend to commit adultery? Those with the most opportunity. Right? You think you're above committing various sins? Well, if you had more opportunity to do things like adultery with attractive young women, you'd probably do a lot more. So the more choices you have, the more power you have, the more access you have, all right, the more likely you are to do these things. And so why did Bill Clinton get so much sex with different women? Because he could. And conservatives are not ragging on Elon Musk. Right? There probably would have been a time when his lifestyle would have disqualified him from a Republican nomination. But Donald Trump has been married 3 times. Right? Nationally syndicated radio show host Dennis Prager married 3 times. And Christians, evangelical Christians in particular, conservatives, have seen that you need to put effectiveness at times ahead of ideology. Evangelical Christians, by and large, understand that the most powerful men are going to face the most sexual temptation, and they display probably more clarity and more common sense than many secular liberals than you might expect. Right? The more power you have, the more money you have, right, the more sexual temptation you will face, and so you can't judge them the same way you judge your ordinary bloke. So when Donald Trump began running for the presidency in 2015, he told Christians in Iowa, if you elect me, you will have power. And under Donald Trump, Christians have power. Donald Trump appointed judges to the U.S. Supreme Court who overturned Roe versus Wade, which was the #1 Christian moral issue in the United States over the past 45 years. So Christians are wising up. Right? As America becomes less Christian, right, they have to go to much greater efforts to maintain the same level of Christianity that was taken for granted, say, in the 1950s. And so these greater efforts to sustain the viability of the Christian way of life are often derided as Christian nationalism. But think of this example. If you are swimming and the tide is going against you at 5 miles an hour, you have to swim at 6 miles an hour to make any progress. And that's what's happening to Christians in America right now. The tide is going against them, and so they have to go to much more intense in-group Christian efforts to try to hold on to power. And when you're fighting for your survival, that often brings with it tremendous clarity. And so Christians recognize how intensely and effectively they must fight for their way of life. And so that is producing clarity. They're not getting distracted that Elon Musk has 13 kids with multiple different women. So we live in a new world.
But for the richest man in the world, if you look historically, very powerful men sometimes had children in the hundreds, famously Genghis Khan. Something like 8% of men in Asia can trace their lineage back to this one figure in history. The most prolific male in history was this guy, a Moroccan emperor named Ishmael the Bloodthirsty, who had more than, I think, 800 children in total.
He wasn't just bloodthirsty.
With obviously probably well into the hundreds of women. And so I think we're sort of shifting now, maybe more tilting towards that direction where monogamy and marriage and stability and committing to one partner, that has been the historical norm in Western countries for quite some time. But now that the expectations are loosening, the guardrails are starting to come undone, that even Republicans and conservatives are adopting this more permissive view of relationships.
Look, you're fighting for your survival. You have to fight more effectively. And the more desperate your circumstance, the more clarity is at a premium. So Donald Trump made tactical alliances with the pro-life crowd, and then he broke with GOP social conservatives in 2024. He vowed to veto a nationwide abortion ban. He backed marijuana legalization, which I hate. I loathe marijuana. I loathe legalizing marijuana. Trump claimed to be the father of IVF. I think it's ridiculous that many Christians are anti-IVF. So you could argue bawdy barstool conservatism reigns among Republicans. Not quite accurate. There's no longer a substantial constituency for politicizing America's private choices, right? But there is a constituency that Trump is mobilizing to control the behavior that is shaping society. And I think this is the wise way to go. One of the things I love about Judaism is its clarity on private versus public. Right, if you are engaged in behavior privately that nobody knows about, that is very different from publicly engaging in behavior that damages the community. Right, private vice is usually much less serious to the health of the community than public vice. Right, so conservatives care about the bathrooms that people use because it is a violation of their hero system to have men who think they're women going to use the female bathroom, right? Conservatives care about shoplifting at the drugstore, as they should. They care about IV drug use on the street, right? Elon Musk blames the woke mind virus for one of his kids identifying as transgender. So I think that conservatives have gotten a lot more clarity and a lot more effective. Donald Trump has taught Republicans how to fight and how to run for political office and how to govern. And so Americans are less interested in legislating about what takes place in people's private homes, within their own families, or on their laptops, right? They are motivated more by issues of public behavior, right? They want to take back the public square. And they understand this profound distinction between public and private, right? In 2020, that summer of George, right, you had radical social justice advocates noticing that Americans had grown more permissive of private indiscretion, and so they pushed for more public tolerance of deviance, right? I'm reading from the Free Press here. So you had a ballot measure that decriminalized the possession of small amounts of drugs in Oregon. You had Manhattan's DA saying he would no longer prosecute prostitutes. And then you had a backlash, right? Oregon repealed the decriminalization. California got tough on property crime law. So it's not like one type of permissiveness in the private sphere begets permissiveness in the public sphere. All right, Republicans have made room in their party. They have expanded their base. And they are not as fixated on private choices, right? There is a new moral majority. It's still up for grabs, all right? Both sides could still capture the votes of elderly women sick of smelling pot when they go for a walk, or the gay dad who objects to drag queen story hour at his kid's school, or people who can't stand diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So whoever gets lopsided support for these views will win the votes of a powerful constituency.
In my book, Troubled, I talk about this kind of shift over time. So if you go back to 2006, and you ask Americans in general, is it important for children to be raised by two married parents? The majority of Americans said yes, and by far the majority of Republicans said yes. It was something on the order of 80%, maybe closer to 90% of registered Republicans said it's important for children to be raised by two married parents. This was 2006. By 2020, for Republicans, it had dropped to 60%. So a massive decline over the course of those 14 or 15 years. It's still the majority, but much less than it used to be. And so I think even, it used to be more so on the left that there was this skepticism towards marriage and monogamy and committing to one partner for the duration of your lifespan, but now we're seeing it on the right as well.
We had it here in Britain a bit with Boris Johnson, who has a famously complicated love life. And it was always thought to be a potential flaw in him being a prime minister, an electoral flaw for him. But actually, I spoke to people who canvassed with him, and they said because his sort of private life reflected increasingly the private lives of most people. Marriages are breaking down a lot. A lot of people have children with different...
And it depends on your personality. All right, if you are an appealing personality like Boris Johnson, if you're incredibly likable, people are going to be willing to forgive you for a lot more than they will forgive someone who's not likable.
Partners, and therefore he actually related to them to a certain extent. And I'm not sure many people can relate to the Elon Musk situation, but certainly Trump's, marriages, multiple marriages, the religious right was not comfortable with him in 2016, but they're much more comfortable with him now. And there's something going on there, as well as what you point towards, which is this kind of idea that if you're a real alpha male, and particularly this sort of growing manosphere that we have, if you're a real alpha male, the thing to do is just to procreate as much as you can.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like from the conservative perspective, conservatives are often accused of wanting to go back in history, rewind the clock back to the 1950s or something. But actually, I guess you could argue like certain strands of conservative movements, reactionary movements, they could say, oh no, we don't want to go back to the 50s. We want to go back to not the 1950s, but say like the 1050s, right? or literally 20,000 years ago when we were still hunter-gatherers in these nomadic bands where the relationship expectations were very different. And I find it interesting. So obviously, people are focusing on Elon Musk. Less, I guess, responsibility seems to be placed on someone like Ashley St. Clair. I'm also curious about the psychology of, women who would, obviously Elon Musk is this famous figure. We know about his history and his relationships and how many children he has. And then also to volunteer to be the next mother of his next child. I'm curious about what's going on there as well. I'm thinking about this line from Steven Pinker in his great book, How the Mind Works. He's a great Harvard psychologist, and in How the Mind Works, he's talking about, status and sex and relationships, and he says that, it's kind of simplified, but he says many women would prefer to be the third wife of John F. Kennedy than the first and only wife of Bobo the Clown, right? And the point here being that, if you have this array of options, you'll take the high status man, even if you have to share his attention and resources and interest, versus, you look at other men who maybe are less impressive or less desirable, and you'd rather just not partner with them. And I think this is also kind of a shift in the culture where we're tilting more, I think, towards this maybe like a softer version of polyamory, of relationship, open, casual relationship structures. I don't think this is great, especially if there are children involved. I think for someone like Elon Musk, if you're a multi-billionaire and you can hire nannies and help and have all of these structures in place to help raise kids, then maybe it can work for you. But for the majority of people, having multiple baby mamas usually looks like disorder and disaster.
Because you wrote a very interesting essay about...
So another article that I'm looking at here in the Free Press, and the headline pretty much sums it up. All men want to be heroes. America needs to give them a chance. All right. Men need male-only spaces. Men need rituals reserved just for them. Men need a role. And Dennis Prager would make this argument that civilization depends on creating special roles for men. Because unless you allow for special rituals, special roles for men, men do not want to compete with women. And Prager argues that girls become women much more naturally than boys become men. And I think there's something to what Prager is saying. You have to create mentorship, male-only spaces, specific rituals, specific areas of life just for men to learn how to become men. It's not nearly as natural an occurrence as girls becoming women. Kip says half of America celebrated when OJ got away with double homicide. No, half of America did not celebrate. About 13% of America celebrated. Right? Most Americans thought that was horrible. Kip says Republicans did not expand their base in last election. The libs strangled their base. Kim says we went from 2 to 3 jobs in a lifetime and only one life partner to dozens of jobs and maybe a few buddies along the way. Morality, what morality? This is America. Well, no matter how disengaged you may become from believing in traditional standards of morality, the fact is that the way people experience life is certain things are definitely wrong, certain things are definitely right. Right? Everybody's got a hero system, even those who deny that there's such a thing as transcendent standards of right and wrong. Right? Even those people still have a hero system. I love this Lindy Lee interview.
I can't.
You know, but so then you move on, age 24, you run for Congress.
I was an investment banker at that time, Morgan Stanley.
You were an investment banker.
Yes, Morgan Stanley.
And then you ran for Congress.
Yeah, I hated Wall Street. It was so empty. I started, people just didn't really give a shit about anything but money.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you get involved in the White House?
Oh, I think I skipped a major part. Well, I was the first woman at Princeton to be elected president all 4 years, and that gave me the confidence to do whatever I wanted. Like, I just knew that so at age 17, I was knocking on hundreds of doors and getting rejected and, you know, spit on and vilified. But that gave me the resilience to just keep going. And let me tell you, you know, Steve Carell, he was a graduation speaker that day for my graduation, and it was raining. It's online. On graduation day, the dean of the university told me not to give my speech because of the rain. I told Steve that. I said, they're not going to let me give my speech. I've waited for this year for 4 years. And Steve told me, you're on live TV. If you go up, they can't pull you back down. So that's what I did.
Nice.
That day,
So one of the greatest temptations in life is the temptation to become a Captain Save-A-Ho. So when I wrote about the porn industry for about a decade, and there were times that I'd feel my Captain Save-A-Ho, you know, rise to the surface. There were porn stars who I knew who would feel suicidal, and you know, I'd talk with them, and sometimes someone would need a ride from the hospital. All right, so there were times that my Captain Save-A-Ho would rise to the surface. Now I'm watching The Mayor of Kingstown, and the mayor, right, the lead character, right, goes to enormous lengths and suffers to try to save and protect and rehabilitate this prostitute. And when she's not entirely comfortable with the overnight arrangements he made for her to stay in the home of his brother's family, right, she flees out the window and goes back to her pimp. And so I'm looking here at X, and we've got an announcement from Financial Times. The Trump administration has pressured Romanian authorities to lift travel restrictions on the self-described misogynist influencer Andrew Tate. And Claire Lehman says, pimping young girls is not and should not be a conservative value, just so that we are clear. I am no fan of the Tate brothers. But there are varying degrees of evil when it comes to pimping, and many women seek out a pimp. And if you got a strong pimp hand and women seek you out to pimp them out, right, that clouds the moral picture. It was heartbreaking to watch this TV series created and written by Taylor Sheridan of this, you know, gorgeous young prostitute and how she is punished and degraded by some Balkan mafia, and the lengths to which the protagonist goes to try to rescue her and to save her and to rehabilitate her. And then when she feels slightly uncomfortable with her overnight living arrangements, she escapes out the window, goes right back to her pimp. I remember I was looking for a topic to write a book on in 1995, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll write a book on sex trafficking. And I remember calling people in the LAPD, and they said, no, there's very little sex trafficking going on. Most of what's called sex trafficking is women voluntarily becoming prostitutes and just looking for the right pimp.
I had won re-election as alumni president, so they had to call me up. And when I went up, I gave my whole speech, not a word.
So I remember talking to a journalist in 2004, and he wanted to go to Eastern Europe to combat sex trafficking, and at the same time, he wanted to sleep with a lot of hot European women. So, Captain Save-A-Ho, quite a complicated emotion for many men. In general, prostitutes don't make for good wives. In general, you don't want to become vulnerable to prostitutes. They will spin you round, right round.
Here, Biden's cognitive decline. And so you're basically coming out and saying that the cover-up of Joe Biden's cognitive decline, basically, it's not a conspiracy. He was declining, correct?
The conspiracy was a cover-up. That is conspiracy, and it was a years-long conspiracy, and it started escalating in 2022. His situation got seriously worse.
There is so much mocking of this woman on the right. They're gathering her old pro-Democratic Party tweets. She was a Democratic Party strategist and fundraiser. Right? If you like winning, you should welcome people who join your team from the opposing team. And yet, I guess competing voices, right? People for their own petty status reasons on the right are just trying to tear this woman down. She changed teams. She has, in large part, joined our team. And yet all over X and on National Review, you have all these conservatives who just seem to be jealous of the attention and positive feedback that this woman is receiving because they feel like it takes away from their attention. And they're doing everything they can to tear this woman down. Look, if someone joins your team, you should welcome them.
I was on the trail with him in 2019. I went to San Francisco. I was actually with him the day after the debate. Do you remember when Kamala called him the racist? Do you remember that day?
No, but I remember in 2020 and parts of 2019, I don't watch any legacy media anymore. But at the time I did because COVID was rampant. Obviously, it was the start of it. So everybody's glued, what's going on, what's happening. And at the same time, the debates were getting ready to fire up. And I remember Fox kept saying over and over again that this guy, he's not with it. Nobody's at the wheel. Nobody's driving this train. This is basically just describing what we all know is true. But I didn't buy into it. I was like, this has to be way over embellished. There's no way somebody would be running for president. And then I remember watching the first debate with my wife, and I saw him come up, and I saw him struggling to put a sentence together, and I was like, holy shit, this is real. And so, I didn't understand how anybody bought off on it from the first debate. I can't even remember exactly what he said. We're going to roll some of the clips during the interview of how that went. But I mean, I thought it was very apparent right at the very get-go, debate one, that he wasn't with it. And so when did you notice?
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with every.
Okay, I think we remember how bad Biden was in that debate. But as someone who grew up a Protestant, converted to Orthodox Judaism, one of the differences that I've noticed now, thinking back on my old Anglo upbringing, is that Anglos and Protestants are about the only group in the world where parents do not tend to live through their kids. And there's a good quality to that. Dennis Prager made that observation. I'm quoting him. I noticed that Asian parents and Jewish parents tend to invest more in their children than Anglo parents, but also that investment comes with much higher demands and expectations. So my parents made very little effort to try to shape what I did as an adult. Once I became an adult, they didn't try to tell me what I should study more than like a handful of times. My father told me you'd be a good lawyer. But other than that, right, I just had the freedom essentially to go my own way. Some people thrive with freedom, but for virtually everyone, there are areas of your life where you don't want more freedom because it just takes up time and processing power. So that's why we develop habits. Like I love habits because I get to bypass right, the processing power of having to make decisions. So I have rituals. I have procedures, so I don't have to think. I can just act through much of my life, particularly when I'm in the early morning hours, right? When I'm stumbling out of bed, I want to have an early morning routine to get my day started out right. I don't want to be spending processing power making decisions. We only have so much willpower, right? We only have a limited amount of processing power, and that's why you want to land the planes of resentment and unnecessary fear in your head so that you're not burning up your processing power, and you don't want to be burning up your willpower because it's so limited. So if you have rituals, procedures of how you go through life, you're not burning up your willpower. So Martin Gurry has a thoughtful essay here in the Free Press. What does it mean to be a man? And I lashed out, I think, spent $80 for an annual subscription to the Free Press, in part to read Martin Gurry. He says, in a world of eunuchs, buffoons, and beasts, we need new heroes. So there is a dysfunctional need for heroes, and there is a functional need for heroes. So I've often had a dysfunctional need for heroes. I would want to get close to people in power because I felt like their power would rub off on me or reflect on me, and it was a way of feeding my narcissism. On the other hand, you can use heroes for inspiration. Freedom is just another name for non-helicopter parents. Freedom is just another name for nothing to lose. Right? The more connected you are, the more things you have to lose. But with every connection comes some decrease in certain types of freedom, and many people just can't stand that. It just eats away at them, and so they lead individual lives largely separate from community. But we evolved as social creatures, right? We evolved for millions of years living in bands of up to 150 people. So I think Prager is right that boys do not become men as naturally as girls become women. Right? A high-functioning society teaches boys to become protectors and providers and to defend that which is sacred in your community, right? To protect the good, to be courageous, to be strong, to be loyal, to protect the nation, to protect the wife, the children, right? To be physically strong, mentally strong. Now, in modern times, what are men supposed to protect against? So it used to be that women and children would depend on the man to bring home the bacon, but then we've got massive government welfare programs, so this need for men to protect and provide is not as keen today as it used to be prior to the 1960s. Right? It was the perils of the ancestral environment. It was things like snakes and spiders that we still have an evolutionary, horror of. But today, right, we live in a different world from when the natural environment was our greatest threat. Protecting against hunger and poverty, right, have largely become the responsibility of the state. Our biggest enemies tend to be other men, right? Men commit about 95% of murders. So we have the man beast, right? Men are usually ready to commit killing when necessary, particularly to defend the ones we love. Some men even love it. Now, May 2023, we had this unhinged homeless man screaming on the F train in New York City subway that he wanted to kill, and he was willing to die. And one of the passengers, 24-year-old ex-Marine Daniel Penny, he stepped up, right? He saw the other people on the train, and he felt like the threat was imminent and that something had to be done. So he became a hero. Yet he was arrested and he was put on trial for second-degree manslaughter, which could have given him a sentence of up to 15 years in prison. Right? Black Lives Matter called for black vigilantes to retaliate. Right? He was a hero, and yet our system punished him. So we need men to step up and to be heroes. We need men to restore the moral balance of society. Men need to be heroes. Right? That's a normal, healthy male need. Right? A society deprived of this heroic male energy is going to be a weak society. So in Europe, we had the development of the idea of the gentleman. Perhaps we need to bring back the idea of the gentleman. This was the man who wanted to be a hero, knew his own capability of violence, but wanted to also live up to his Christian duty, to have empathy, to protect the weak and the vulnerable, to protect women and children. And the gentleman isn't primarily seeking fanfare and fame and greatness, but rather wants to create a decent society. He wants to be tender towards the vulnerable, merciful towards those who need mercy, and strong towards the predator. Right? So the gentleman has traditionally in European society stood at the pinnacle of the man-ruled world. Well, we no longer have the man-ruled world. We no longer have as frequently the image of God as a man who has moral commands. And thinking about God as a man is much more helpful for men to attune to God and to his moral demands. So feminism and modern liberalism kind of cuts away and against these traditional incentives to become a hero or just to become a gentleman. We've got postmodern manhood now. It's amorphous, it's uncertain. And men often don't know their role. In more cohesive communities, and communities are not struggling with the DEI and government intrusion of the civil rights industrial complex, right, it's much easier to develop rituals and procedures for boys to become men. Right? We've got a sustained assault on the male virtues throughout society. The gentleman has in large part gone extinct, even though his qualities are still wildly admired. Right? Women and children exited first from the sinking airplane that went down in the Hudson River in January 2009, so no different from what transpired 97 years before when the Titanic capsized. Physical prowess, the foundation of manhood traditionally, has been downgraded and devalued. We've watered down standards of fitness for the military and for the police to make allowances for women. We have watered down discipline because it's very hard to discipline women the same way that you discipline men. And women no longer feel protected, so they demand safe spaces, trigger warnings, increasing government regulation. There's a loss of agency and meaning. We have spiking rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide among young women. We've got a rapid rise in the number of transsexuals. Men have been banished to the shadows. So we've got Trump now versus the war on men. So under the Biden administration, the war on men became official government policy. Biden deliberately chose only a woman of color as his vice president. He appointed a trans woman to be admiral in the Pentagon. He engaged in a legal crusade and a government crusade on behalf of transgenderism. 63% of his judicial appointments were women. His administration's favorite buzzword was equity, right? Meaning punishing men for their past transgressions. Right, we had a flabby and flaccid style of government. Unlike women, American men have never migrated to the left. Some died from fentanyl. Some became incels. Right, some flocked to self-improvement prophets like Jordan Peterson. Trump's election has signified a revolt of normal men against the regime that had demonized them. Trump is a hero figure. He's got an unbelievable amount of energy, but Trump, the man, is impossible to replicate. Men have now regained their political manhood, but what does this mean? We've got a public mental health crisis going on right now with the left. Will we allow communities to develop more rituals, more procedures for boys to become men? Will we have a return of Christian standards of the gentleman? Will we have a return to standards of physical strength in our police forces, our firefighters, in our military? Right, we need more male heroes, more male role models. We need more traditional communities that will help men become all that they can be.
2020, I was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. He told me that it was a stutter and a speech impediment. So I was like, okay, all right, maybe it is. Maybe it gets worse with age. I'll extend him grace. And this is a guy who showed me tremendous kindness. I actually met him not through politics. I met him because I was a trustee of the American Association for Cancer Research. I met him in 2016. Okay, so I'd known him when I was 25. And because he showed me kindness then, I believed him. Like, I decided to, okay, maybe he just is tripping over his words, but this is a guy who still has control over his mental faculties. So in 2019, 2020, I didn't really think it was an issue. It just didn't really occur to me. And I wasn't watching Fox then. So it wasn't a narrative that I was exposed to.
You didn't see slow decision-making or inability to put, I mean, you chalked that up.
He remembered my dad's name at that point, which I thought was impressive because most people wouldn't. Like, and it wasn't, he doesn't like hang out with my dad. He just met him once. So I thought it was impressive. Maybe it was just good luck on his part that he happened to remember that my dad's name is Richard.
So, I mean, and then, you know, I wanted, you were a big fundraiser for the campaign too. So I wanted to, let's dive into a little bit of the campaign. You know, back then, you know, there were all these, Trump had thousands of people showing up. Biden wasn't really, he didn't have anybody showing up at that.
Yeah, and I want to bring I don't think people realize this. In May 2019, when he was running for president the first time, I remember talking to a friend and saying, there's more press here than actual attendees. Like, what's going on here? This is in the middle of Philadelphia. It's a hugely Democratic city. Mm-hmm. The turnout should be much more robust than this. I thought it was just because it was hot that day. Like, Sean, I realize now that I was making so many excuses for him. But I really, when someone is your friend, you really just want to give him the benefit of the doubt. But at some point, you realize that reality is just way too discordant with the narrative that they're presenting. So around 2021, 2022, I was like, okay, this is getting to be a little bit ridiculous.
Okay, so here's some news on this plane, Delta plane. Of course, says N quarter, it's Delta. So a Delta flight carrying 80 passengers from Minnesota crash landed at Toronto Airport. No casualties reported. Passengers have safely exited the plane, which flipped upside down. Okay, here's Eric Kaufman.
So there is this trend kind of in the elite culture that's been building. And what's happened partly is that the Republican Party used to be just the party of low taxes and more money in your pocket. So if you're rich, you know, if you're educated, you tended to be rich, you vote for them. But so that's been changing now. The Republican Party stands for the cultural right more than the economic right. And so what you have with these elites is people are economically to the right. They want low tax, but they're culturally to the left. They believe in maybe open borders. They believe in, you know, low-cost labor. They believe in woke because they think that's how you're a good person.
Yeah. And so I wanted to really ask you about, well, how did we get here, and why did everything get so weird?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, and are we rolling? Or
we're rolling.
Oh, we're sorry.
Yeah, this is the interview, man.
Okay. Right. Well, that's a big question. So how did we get where we are? I mean, that story goes back, you know, in some ways it goes back to the French Revolution 200 years ago and the rise of, but more recently, let's just take the last 120 years. There was this movement called liberal progressivism out of the U.S. in the first decade of the 20th century, people like John Dewey and Jane Addams. And for the first time, here was a movement that combined being left on the economy, kind of, with being very kind of liberal culturally. Those two things used to be very separate. And in fact, people who were left economically were often quite what we would consider conservative culturally. So what the original progressive movement of the late 19th century believed in prohibiting alcohol, restricting immigration, for example. They had some quite conservative, what we would consider conservative views, but then they also believed in doing something for the poor. They saw cities as kind of wicked and sinful, but they believed in social improvement and social action. What happened is in the early 20th century, you now get a group of people who take part of that, which is the let's do charity and social action part, but then they dump the prohibition of alcohol, the restriction of immigration, the worries about the city, all that stuff goes away. So then they take on some of these liberal attitudes, which had been only attached to pretty free market type people. So we're living with the outworking of the logic of liberal progressivism as it starts in the early 20th century, gets stronger through each of the wars, because kind of communism falls, fascism falls, total free market capitalism falls. You know, we come up with this mixed welfare state. But this idea of being liberal left on culture just goes from strength to strength. Now, it starts off it's mainly talking about white ethnics, Jews and Italians, and these people having their right to their culture and whatever. And it was pretty moderate in many ways. But then as we get into the 1960s, it then starts to take off and we get more radical stuff coming in.
Examples?
So we get, affirmative action. So what was the liberal progressives were mainly concerned with white immigrant groups. They now, when we go to the 1960s New Left, or the inheritors of this left liberalism on culture, they now are focused on racial minorities. The whites have kind of assimilated and melted. So they're focused on racial minorities. And the first things are, for example, taking a very romantic attitude to urban riots, burning down neighborhoods, romanticizing the Black Panthers, who were extremely violent, often terrorist in their ambitions. Affirmative action, this idea that essentially there should be goals and timetables for achieving equal outcomes in proportional quota terms for jobs and contracts, and then later universities. So that's a really radical idea. It's already happening in the late 60s. So when Donald Trump, he just rescinded President LBJ, Lyndon Johnson's executive order on affirmative action. That's from the late 60s. So they had gone off the rails already by then. And that's the beginnings. And then the other stuff happens a little bit later. So you have affirmative action first. The stuff around political correctness happens in the late 80s, early 90s. So by 1991, you got 300 leading U.S. universities that have these speech codes. You've got university newspapers that made fun of affirmative action being shut down by UCLA. So a lot of the stuff we're familiar with in the Great Awakening was already going on, but just not at the same scale and only on the campus, not in the New York Times, not in the newspapers, but on the campus it was happening.
What's driving it?
And what's driving it is basically, I look at it a bit like, how your DNA unfolds over your lifetime. It's like a computer program.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is like, you think of these ideas, what I will call cultural left liberalism, which is basically the overlap of two ideas. One which says, you should you should reject tradition. You should always go for difference rather than commonality, and always be expressing yourself against whatever traditions or social restraints there are. So that's kind of what I'll call what some have called modernism. Daniel Bell, who's a critic of all this, or expressive individualism. So that's one strand of this kind of liberation thing. The second strand of this is what you can call equality and humanitarianism. We're going to be really nice to the very weak, and we're going to want to make the last first. And this sort of kind of bleeding heart liberalism is the other part of this. If you crank the dial on both of those, instead of talking about real harms to minorities like discrimination and police beatings, we're now talking about microaggressions. You raised an eyebrow. You said they were very articulate. You said anybody can get ahead in Britain.
And then put maybe the front wheel down first and then the second wheel. Do you think that the winds may have tipped them and snapped this wing?
Yeah, you could have. That can happen where you have a bit of a crosswind, and this is more technical, forgive me, but you end up doing a little bit of a lowering a wing into the wind, into the crosswind. So in this case, I'm guessing it would have been off to the right, but you could have hit the tip of that wing. And yes, these are suppositions. I haven't seen any videos yet.
And these are all things that are interpreted as, denying the reality of systemic racism, right? So that's kind of what I mean by the dial just keeps getting cranked and cranked and cranked. And there are these three kind of waves where the craziness goes up, it then calms down a bit, and then it goes up again, but to a higher place. So there was craziness when I first went to university in the early 90s around political correctness, but it's even crazier now. The number of professors being fired, the number of speakers being no platform is much higher. So the scale is just higher. The degree of hair trigger sensitivity around different phrases, it used to be things which, there used to be actual real racist incidents in dorms in university in the 90s. Now they're almost all fake. They're almost all hoax. That's what I mean, is they're just, all of these things are just being taken up a notch. But the basic idea remains the same. And so I don't think the ideas are that different. I just think the dial's been twisted and it's spread off the campus. There's a lot of crazy ideas on campus in the 80s. Critical race theory, that's beginning in the 70s and the 80s. It's not new, but sticking it in schools and shoving it down people's throat in schools is new. So it's a spreading out and making it mass. Social media helps on that.
So does a lot of the root rot of this come from academia then?
Yeah, in a way, I would say that, these ideas start, they start in the general, amongst small groups of bohemian intellectuals, really small numbers of people, no influence at all. They then, as the universities start to expand in the 60s, they're sucked into these universities. That allows them to spread. The centralized television media instead of local radio, that takes over in the 60s. You get all of these mechanisms for expansion of what used to be just a small number of really avant-garde out there humanitarians and artists. Well, suddenly that's taken off and getting crazier as it takes off. But I think what's noticeable, like if you take the 2010s up until our moment, what you can really see is these ideas spread off campus. And we can track that using big data. For example, if you look at the terms, so-called social justice terms like systemic racism, white supremacy, homophobia, these sorts of words were used pretty heavily already in academic articles in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s. It's not till we get the social media and we get the new media model, which relies on clicks and virality on social media. And then all of a sudden, all of these terms are showing up in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all these and the Times of London. So all of these, that used to be a kind of firewall between, not a firewall, but the mainstream media used to be much more sensible. The New York Times was really critical of Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and these 60s radicals. The New York Times was quite buttoned up. Now they're beating the drum along with the crazy academics about, systemic racism, and they get a nutcase like Nicole Hannah-Jones and to do her 1619 project that the U.S. slavery was the founding of the United States, and that gets a prize. What was the name of the literary prize? I'm trying to remember. But anyway, this is all something that's now mainstreamed in the press when it used to be actually just narrowly on certain campuses. Berkeley, only in the gender studies or racial studies department, maybe a bit of sociology. But this has really kind of burst that kind of blood-brain barrier, and now it's just everywhere.
So what, the social media aspect kind of amped it up because there are, many more voices, independent voices who now because everyone gets to have a voice with social media. And there's a group of people, we've gone through a period of fear of cancellation. So I think on certain issues, people have held private opinions which are different from their public opinion.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think it depends. So in the police, I have no doubt the average officer doesn't go along with the rainbow stuff to anywhere like the same extent as their police force. But in academia, a lot of this stuff is supported by a majority of academics. Mandatory DEI, what are called DEI statements. So you have to pledge that you will advance diversity, equity, and inclusion before you can apply for a grant and apply for a job. What are basically political loyalty oaths or litmus tests. That's supported by academics in elite institutions like 2-to-1. Now, the latest survey I've seen shows they sort of step back a little bit from that 2-to-1, and it may be like 55-45. But
it sounds like coercion.
It is coercion because they're in a bubble. Universities, the left outnumbers the right. Like if we take social sciences in Britain, academics is 9-to-1 left to right. If we take it in the U.S., it's 13-to-1, maybe 14-to-1, and the one is in the closet. So they're in an echo chamber, and when you're in an echo chamber, and all the studies show this, you just push each other towards the extreme. There's no check on the extremism. So they think this is just being a nice person. And then when you point out, well, actually, diversity and equity, which means equal outcomes. If you want equal outcomes, you're going to have to treat people unequally. So you're going to have to discriminate against, say, white applicants to Harvard and Asian applicants in order to get enough African Americans to make their quota. They think, oh, no, this is just equality. But no, what it is it's unequal treatment. So you discriminate against an equally qualified white person, let's say. And they just don't see that because there's no one's pointing it out to them because they're only amongst like-minded people. So they just kind of think this isn't political, but of course it is. Inclusion, the I bit, is basically about, well, I have to stifle your free speech because, you might upset a member of a quote-unquote marginalized group, and, that would be not very inclusive. So the point there is that clamping down on free speech, again, they just rationalize it to themselves. No, we believe in free speech. It's just that, your speech makes someone feel unfree, so it's not free speech. I mean...
So the Trump administration seems to be going to bat for the Tate brothers. Here's a contradictory perspective.
I made a video not too long ago talking about how the biggest mistake that MAGA can make is Andrew Tate. And, well, right now this is what we're looking at, right? President Trump is pressuring Romanian authorities to lift restrictions on the Tate brothers. See, this is why you people should just listen to me all the fucking time. Just every time I open my fucking mouth, you just listen, blindly follow me at this point. Because I'm batting a fucking 1,000 on red flags. And I just don't know. I don't know how else I can get it through your thick fucking heads. Andrew Tate is a sex trafficking pedophile. Period. Right? So, where's this source from? You can see here in the comment section, he provides a link. Let's click on it. The Financial Times, not exactly a tabloid, okay? And let's see what evidence they have that this is actually true. Tate's case was brought up by U.S. officials in a phone call with the Romanian government and then followed up by the Trump special envoy, Richard Grenell. Richard Grenell, the first gay cabinet member ever. That doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm just saying that's how he's pretty much known, right? It's like Trump's not a homophobic piece of shit. He brought in Rich Grenell. This is a very, very close Trump associate. He declined to comment on the exchange, and here's why I want to make sure that everybody's well aware. This is unverified, but still a problem. Rich Grenell had said that he had no substantive conversation with Harrison. But I support the Tate brothers as evident by my publicly available tweets. That's the fucking problem. It's not whether or not this story is 100% true and Trump's actually pressuring the Romanian government to go out and wipe Andrew Tate's slate clean. I don't think he can even fucking do that. The problem is we're finding out more evidence that the Tate brothers have weaseled their fucking way into the Trump orbit. Remember this? Trump's lawyer and now cabinet member, Alina Habba, from her fucking Wikipedia page, is saying that she is a big fan and hasn't posted a retraction. Now, right about this point, you're probably like, show the proof. Where's your proof, dude? You're just making shit up. Okay.
Listen.
Wait for it.
Did I say the word listen? Did I say the word listen?
That was Vivian. Now, if you listen to Andrew Tate says that was his adult girlfriend and they were just into some kinky shit. And it's completely taken out of context. The problem is, it has been verified 6 fucking ways from Sunday, and it's even in the fucking charging documents, that Vivian, at the time of that video, was 14 or 15 years old. And he was in his late 20s. All right? Andrew Tate has come out and lied about his entire fucking past, saying that he hasn't done cam work in 10 years, even though he only stopped doing cam work when he was indicted a couple of years ago. The fucking guy is fleecing MAGA and trying to make himself look like Donald Trump, where it's just a bunch of women are coming at accusations because he's so powerful and he's taking down the fucking Matrix. He's not. He's retarded. All right? He's just a grifter, and people are falling for the grift because he's very well spoken and he's a master manipulator. But here's the deal. I posted this whole fucking article on my X page. Go read the whole fucking thing, and it's accurate. And if you can fucking debunk it, let me know. The biggest problem that I have with this, it's not some vendetta against Andrew Tate. I'm not jealous. I don't give a fuck about the fact that he gets more attention than me. It's the fact that he's Timu Epstein. He's trying to weasel his way into politics, which is why he's talking about running for the Prime Minister of Britain and getting in close with Donald Trump and any type of influence, because he is panicking. He knows he's going to lose his case. So this is his Hail Mary pass, okay? Lie to MAGA. Get MAGA to accept them, so MAGA tells Donald Trump to help him out. Because Donald Trump actually was falsely accused of fucking rape by a crazy lady who doesn't remember when it happened. It was an episode of Law & Order Special Victims Unit. Not the same thing. So here's the deal. I'm going to ask you to do the hardest fucking thing you have ever fucking done in your entire fucking life if you are still on the fence or supportive of Andrew Tate. Admit you are fucking wrong. It's
So that's the way they reason, right?
Is there a psychology to this in that, say, somebody new who's entered the profession is presented with this oath they have to, they have to swear to, that they don't fundamentally believe it to begin with, but in doing so they become co-opted into it, and over time they do start to believe it themselves and support it. Is there a psychology to it?
I wonder. I think there might be. I think that some do follow that path, but I think for the most part, there's a self-selection process where it's made very clear, just in the jokes people tell. They joke about Brexit, they joke about the Conservatives. If you are a conservative or a Brexit supporter, you're going to steer clear of that social environment. So you're not going to go into get a PhD or go into academia because that's not a place you feel welcome, because people are quite openly going to discriminate against you. So I think there's a certain degree to which that environment repels prospective people who might go into an academic career. And I've done research on this, which shows that, if you take right-leaning graduate students at the master's level, like 2/3 of them will say their department's a hostile environment. 3/4 of conservative academics will say their department is a hostile environment for their political beliefs. So the hostility is pretty obvious. And so all other things being equal, if you are on the right, you'll just take another career route. You'll maybe go into a think tank, or you'll go to be in journalism on a conservative newspaper. So that the problem is the pipeline then becomes really, really, a monoculture, and it reproduces a lack of viewpoint diversity. So everybody is in a bubble, and those who aren't are in the closet. And so that's where we are right now.
And so is that a reason why we've ended up with so for example in the UK we had Liz Truss in here. She talked about how the civil service has become very much a left-leaning part of government. It's very hard for somebody in government to work against those parts of the civil service, and that if you're not overtly conservative, you end up swinging to the left. And is that because the people we're producing from academia are predominantly on the left, and they're affecting these institutions, which has led us to this place where I would say the liberal Western democracies have become very left-leaning. I mean, even the Conservative Party now, I consider them a left-wing party.
No, I think you're right on the things that many of us care about. I think they are left-leaning, migration, culture. But what I'd say is, here's what I think is going on, and if you look at, for example, U.S. has very good data on a lot of things, which they tend to have, and so one of the things they have data on is political donations by profession. Now, granted, only a couple % of the population give more than $200 to a party, but if you look at the Republican-Democrat split in political donations by profession, you look at not academics, fine, Hollywood, fine, that's just overwhelmingly to the left. It's been to the left for a while, but all of these professions, not just those, have been heading left wing. So now it's lawyers, and it's doctors, and it's even people working in the insurance business. Like everybody is all of those professions are now donating more to the left than to the right. Tech, all of them, despite a few Elon Musks, is overwhelmingly donating to the left. So there is this trend kind of in the elite culture that's been building. And what's happened partly is that the Republican Party used to be just the party of low taxes and more money in your pocket. So if you're rich, if you're educated, you tended to be rich, you vote for them. But so that's been changing now. The Republican Party stands for the cultural right more than the economic right. And so what you have with these elites is people are economically to the right. They want low tax, but they're culturally to the left. They believe in maybe open borders. They believe in, low-cost labor. They believe in woke because they think that's how you're a good person. So I think the rot...
Do they believe it? Or do they act that way to be accepted within the inner circles? Because there was that interview that Rogan did with Mark Andreessen, and he said, he used to be historically a Democrat voter, and everything that's happened weird under the Biden administration, and I think certainly started under Obama's administration, but bled through. He said he's shifted to the right. He was supporting voting for Trump, and he said, I'm no longer invited to certain dinner parties. So we talk about the liberal dinner parties in London. There's certain, I think beliefs that people hold to stay within. It's like a status game.
Yeah. Well, okay, and there's been a few books, Rob Henderson's book and Batya Ungar Sargon and Vivek Ramaswamy. They're all talking about this idea of woke capital, and it's all about status. I'm less of a believer in that. I mean, I think it is to some extent, but I've done a survey where you're anonymous when you do a survey, and I do a little scenario, like let's say in your organization, there's a proposal to have 30% women and 20% minorities, a quota. Or there's a proposal that everyone must sign a diversity statement affirming their commitment to DEI. Would you vote for this at a meeting where you had to raise your hand? Would you vote for it privately where you didn't have to reveal your identity? And what you kind of see is actually there's a significant group of people who support, and it's close to 50% amongst people with degrees. It's not 50, but it's close, who support this stuff and would do it even if it was anonymous. Now, there are some who said, okay, well, I would support it anonymously, but I would actually go the other way. I would actually go the other way anonymously, but in a meeting, I would probably raise my hand. So there's a small number of people who now.
It's a social coercion.
There is a certain element of this, but I think the people who say, oh, well, it's just a spiral of silence and most people are not woke. I don't think that's true. I think, well, most people aren't woke, but I think in these professions, it's evenly balanced. And so when it's evenly balanced and you toss in the reputational status stuff, I think that tips it over. And so I think that's what we're facing. And so I think the problem actually is quite deep. I don't think the universities, by the way, are creating the problem. The studies we have show people's views don't change much from when they enter and leave university. What they learn in class doesn't affect them very much. That's not the issue. The issue is it's happening in the schools. And so the evidence that I've seen in the studies I've done show if you're at a school that is heavy on critical race and gender ideology, you're going to have more views on affirmative action, white guilt, and so on that are to the left. And I've showed that in a study with Zach Goldberg of the Manhattan Institute. And it's pretty substantial, to the point where if you have a mother who's Republican and you go to a school where they're teaching the maximum number of these critical race theory, critical gender concepts in school, and a mother who's Republican and you're in a school that doesn't have any of this, it's like you're twice as likely to be a Democrat, controlling for anything you can think of. So, yeah, the schools are really where this is occurring. And that's one of the reasons I say in my book, Taboo, that the real place we need to target for reform is the curriculum, teacher training, the hiring and firing of teachers. It's got to be really ruthless. Otherwise, the indoctrination will continue, and the young are way more woke than the old. Like,
Eric, don't worry, bro. We did not evolve to be gullible. I'll talk to you later.